Epigraph. Love stole my prayer beads and gave me poetry and song. Rumi. Prologue. One Friday morning, I wandered nearly alone through the Grand Bazaar in Aleppo, Syria. Most of the shops in the usually frantic indoor market, a warren of dank, cross-hatching passageways, lined by fluorescent-lit counters piled high with figs, pistachios, jalabas, even toy trucks and cleaning products, were closing for noonday services. I could already see clumps of men depositing their scuffed shoes outside the Umayyad Mosque, its stately courtyard with old square brick minaret tilted slightly to the right, visible through a pointed archway, admitting a shaft of warm sunlight. It was nearly the beginning of springtime, March 18, 2011, and by day's end, unanticipated by me as well as a surprise to most of the world, a Syrian civil uprising would erupt that within a few years would destroy much of this medieval bazaar and the historic mosque thriving nearby. The only sounds in the bazaar that morning, though, were the cooing of doves fluttering in stone ceilings, vaulted high above a darkened second story, and the clanging shut of a few shop grates. Taking advantage of this pause in all the jostling, I pulled out a little notebook and began drawing a map, trying to figure out the architecture extant from the 13th century, when the young Rumi had been a student in this thrumming Arabic trading town. I was penciling in an axial line for the straight street east to west when a black-haired 20-something-year-old pedaling by on his bike came to a sharp stop. "Where are you from?" he asked in impeccable British English. "America." "Are you a spy?" he said, pointing toward my notebook. No sooner did I shoot him an alarmed look than he broke into an infectious, just-kidding giggle. Sebastian, as he told me his name was, quickly filled in that he had been schooled in England and was now home helping his family with their carpet shop. When he poked for more information about my note-taking, I started filling in quickly too. "I'm writing a biography of Rumi, the Persian Sufi poet. He's famous now and I didn't need to continue spelling out the ABCs of Rumi's life." Sebastian was jolted by my response and erupted into a swoon of rapid questions and comments. "You're writing about Rumi? He's one of my favorite 2 or 3 poets in the entire world. He reminds me of your American poet, Whitman, because he's so universal." Now I too was surprised. Not only was Sebastian one of Rumi's passionate fans, but he also made an apt comparison, which had never occurred to me, with Whitman, likewise a poet of epic intimacy. As we walked a few more steps together, he startled me even more by breaking into a flawless recitation of the opening of Rumi's major poem, Masnavi, not in the original Persian as I might have guessed, but in sing-song stanzas translated in the last century by the eminent Orientalist Cambridge Don, R.A. Nicholson. "Hearken to this reed forlorn, breathing ever since was torn, from its rushy bed a strain of impassioned love and pain." The lines were lovely, if dated, and created a heady effect. But their curious spell didn't last. Sebastian needed to get back to his pile of camel hair carpets and Ottoman blue tiles. "Rumi is in a small group of the greatest poets of all time," he said as his parting thought. "Why? Because, like Whitman, or like Shakespeare, he never tells a secret." After slipping me his business card, he was gone, a silhouette riding his bike through many receding arches past the shuttered shops of the spice and jewelry markets. I instantly felt as if Sebastian, with his dashed provocative comment, had also handed me, as we stood on that basalt slab walkway in the tested souk, an important passkey to the poetry, life, and thought of Rumi. For just a few lines further along in the same poem that he had practically been singing to me, Rumi's reed flute itself sings, "The secret of my song, though near, none can see and none can hear." And then plangently, "Oh, for a friend to know the sign, and mingle all his soul with mine." Yes, I thought, Rumi did have secrets, personal, poetic, and theological, that he was always both revealing and concealing. His was a life full of both mystery and meaning. I was in town investigating one piece of the life of Rumi, who had likely been a theological student in Aleppo in the 1230s, perhaps at the former college which I could just make out across the black and white marble square. Yet I'd been enthralled to Rumi for much longer, beginning with the seductive lines of his verse. For years, the poems of Rumi were my steady pleasure, ever since discovering a paperback of translations by A.J. Arbery, a student of Nicholson's at Cambridge, on a friend's bookshelf in Miami. I spent most of a week's visit reading one after another, drawn in by their ecstatic imagery, if not always understanding their mesh of flashes of wisdom on human and divine love. I am the black cloud in the night of grief who, gladden the day of festival. I am the amazing earth who out of the fire of love filled with air the brain of the sky. A decade later, I found myself among a group of young Muslim Americans in a Sufi group, the mystical branch of Islam, as I was researching a chapter about Islam in New York City for my book God Talk. We met Friday evenings in a modest apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. By then, Rumi was something of a sensation in America, similar to the craze in Victorian England for Khayyam, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou. Because of popular translations by Coleman Barks, Time magazine labeled Rumi the best-selling poet in the US. Extraordinarily prolific, he had indeed composed a 6-book spiritual epic, as well as over 3,000 lyric ghazals and 2,000 four-line rubais. But the circle was less interested in the compelling single lines of verse. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. In Barks's famous version, then with meditations their leader read aloud from Rumi's talks, transcribed and collected in a book titled simply Fihe Mafi, or In it is what is in it. If you accustom yourself to speak well of others, you are always in a paradise. When you do a good deed for someone else, you become a friend to him, and whenever he thinks of you, he will think of you as a friend, and thinking of a friend is as restful as a flower garden. Together, the group constituted a Noah's Ark of stripes and strains of Muslims in America. And from these young men and women of Central Asian, Pakistani, Middle Eastern, North African, Turkish, European, or Canadian background, I learned much more about Rumi's life story and the importance of his religious background and beliefs. The map of Rumi's life stretches over 2,500 miles, and I soon began to travel, trying to put a face and a place to this name in ecstatic style glowing in my mind. I spent 2 summers in Austin, Texas, and Madison, Wisconsin, in intensive Persian programs, getting closer to his native language and beginning to translate his elusive poetry, as all the translations in this biography are mine, in collaboration with the Iranian-American writer Maryam Murtaz. I visited Samarkand in Uzbekistan, the site of a traumatic siege during his boyhood. I followed the old Silk Road into Iran, thinking of the adolescent Rumi traveling west with his family, lulled to sleep by the tinkling saddle bells and Arabic love songs of the camel drivers in endless caravans. I stood at dusk on the bare rocky rise of Mount Kasyoun, overlooking Damascus, for the mature Rumi, paradise on earth. I was struck by similarities between his own violent and tumultuous times and our own. I also realized that all the dots of his life might never be connected, some secrets remaining intact. For this mystic of 800 years ago, poems were occasionally our only hard facts. Interest in Rumi inevitably leads to Konya, in south-central Turkey, where he lived most of the nearly 50 years of his adult life. I visited Konya on the most auspicious and crowded week of the commemoration of Rumi's death, spun by him in advance as his wedding night, on December 17, 1273. My guide was a raven-haired Turkish woman in her early 20s, drawn to Sufism by reading a popular Turkish novel about Rumi. One afternoon she drove me to a 13th century Seljuk inn, or caravanserai, the stone remains of its courtyard and stables, outlined against the sky of a flat, grassy Anatolian steppe, like so many where Rumi had lodged. Having passed a peripatetic boyhood, he found in these way stations a metaphor for human experience. The mind is a caravanserai, Each morning, new guests arrive. All thoughts, happy or sad, our guests. Welcome them. On our way back into Konya, rising on its outskirts like a punctuation mark of devotion to Rumi, not only as a poet, but also as a saint, was the turquoise-tiled cylindrical tower, wrapped in a band of blue and gold calligraphy of his shrine. This burial site is a rose garden, given as a gift for his father's tomb by their patron, the Seljuk Sultan Alauddin Kekobad I. Along with the nearly 5,000 daily visitors, I filed through the chamber, crowded with women sobbing and praying, drawing scarves devoutly over their heads, while men and boys read aloud from books of his poetry, murmuring the words in Persian or Turkish. Rumi's elevated tomb, covered in gold-embroidered black velvet, is placed near those of 65 members of his immediate family, including his second wife. My guide finally dropped me at a private home for a gathering for whirling, the dance central to Rumi's own meditating. I was stopped at the door and said the password, zikr, a word for Sufi prayer I'd learned at the Manhattan group. Inside, one by one, men and women whirled on a low table in a heat of fast drum beats. The next night, I attended the more official ceremony, or sama, at a stadium-sized venue where dozens of whirling dervishes in tan-felt tombstone hats, accompanied by flutes and drums, shed their black woolen cloaks, looking as they spun like white flowers opening, or orbiting planets. Like his contemporary Francis of Assisi, whose Franciscan order cohered mostly after his death, Rumi's circle only later became a standard Sufi order, the Mevlevis, and his practice of meditating while spinning to music was codified into this elegant dance. During the week in 1273 that we were commemorating, Konya had been keyed up too, with much of the population on a death watch for the 66-year-old Rumi, who was as much a public figure as a mystic and poet. His chambers had been hushed for months, except for the mewing of a favorite cat. In those final days, Rumi's thoughts were often on Shams, the transformative friend he felt had opened spiritual dimensions of love and creativity for him. The supposed site of their meeting, now marked by a modest octagonal glass and turquoise-painted metal shrine, resembling a bus stop, on Konya's main boulevard. On his deathbed, Rumi had murmured that while loved ones pulled at him to remain alive, Shams calls me from the other side, and he dictated a number of urgent poems about his impending death, conveying fresh, upbeat messages, including the joyfully brash lines that we visitors could now study, carved into the ornate calligraphy of his sarcophagus. If you visit my grave, my tomb will make you dance. Be sure to bring a tambourine. Rumi's funeral on a grey December day was more like the heated frenzy of whirling I'd witnessed in the Sufi home, rather than in the official Sama ceremony. The turbulent procession originated in his home and school, a site now occupied, as pointed out to me by the director of the Mevlana Museum, by a flimsy, pale blue modern apartment house slated for demolition. Rumi's coffin was carried forth in the morning and did not arrive at the rose garden until sunset, its lid needing to be replaced after being torn off by mourners. Following behind, bareheaded, were not only Muslim imams, Quran reciters, bands of musicians playing tambourines and trumpets Sufi style, as well as singers of Rumi's odes, but also Jewish rabbis reciting psalms and Christian priests reading from the Gospels. They passed through the turreted walls of Konya, which endured into the early 20th century, but have since been reduced to a lonely gate here, some stonework there, such as the archway nearest to the rose garden, still intact, in the midst of a busy traffic circle. Attending those services, which extended long into the night and still stand out in Konya's civic history, was Iraqi, a Sufi poet, not a close friend of Rumi's, more of an acquaintance. On his way out of the cemetery, and over the years, whenever asked, his takeaway remark in Rumi voiced an essential insight that has been echoed to, unintentionally, by Sebastian in the Aleppo Bazaar, and remains a thorough line in history. No one understood him properly. He came into this world as a stranger, and he left as a stranger. Part 1, Chapter 1. In a lightning flash from Hair to Waksh. When Rumi was 5 years old, he saw angels and would occasionally jump up and grow agitated at these visions. A few of the students gathered around his father, Baha'u'llah, then held the boy to their chests to try to calm him. "These are angels from the unseen world," his father reassured him. "They are showing themselves to you to offer you their favors, and have brought visible and invisible gifts for you." He emphasized that these unsettling episodes were nothing to fear, but a sign of being blessed. Baha'u'llah also recalled neighborhood children once visiting his son when he was about 5 or 6 years old on their rooftop on a Friday morning. "Let's jump from this roof to the other roof," a friend shouted. They made a wager on the daring feat, just as his son, scoffing at their game, somehow vanished, causing a clamor. When he reappeared a few minutes later, he announced, "While I was talking to you, I saw some people in green robes. They took me away and helped me to fly and showed me the sky and the planets. When I heard your shouts and screams, they brought me back." The report of a mystical adventure cinched his status among his amazed group of playmates. In several such stories about Rumi's early childhood passed down from his father and his father's pupils, a coherent picture emerges that is consistent with the boy who saw angels, yet managed often enough to stay a step ahead of his peers. The young Rumi was sensitive, nervous, and excitable, but he was also clever, warm, and engaging. The warmth emanated from a family life that he experienced as positive and loving. As he later wrote, "Love is your father and your family." He was eagerly absorbed in childhood fantasy and imagination, yet, given his family and community, this invisible world was mostly religiously tinged. Descended from a line of eminent preachers, his father assumed that his precocious son would follow in his footsteps to the mosque, member, or pulpit. While aspiring later in life to the ecstatic condition of having no name, Rumi was truly a boy and man wrapped in layers of name and titles. His given name was Muhammad, like his father, and like so many of the boys in his neighborhood. Because the name was so common, if glorified, nicknames were useful, such as Khudavankar, a title usually reserved for adult spiritual leaders or seers, as the term was Persian for Lord or Master, which his father conferred on him soon after he began seeing angels. Another of Rumi's honorifics, likewise given by his father, Jalaluddin, means splendor of the faith. In an account in one of his notebooks, Baha'u'llah tenderly referred to his son as "My Jalaluddin Muhammad." Later in life, he tended to be addressed with the title Maulana, for our master or our teacher. Indeed, Rumi, the single name by which he is now known, derived from Rome or Rome, referring to Byzantium, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, including present-day Turkey. Where he spent most of his adult life was used for identifying him by few, if any, during his lifetime. Like most young children until puberty, Rumi spent his earliest childhood years behind the protective walls of the harem, a more intimate and separate domain in a traditional Muslim household where the women lived and walked about unveiled. He stayed not only with his mother Momin, about whom little is known, though she was later credited with the honor of descent from the house of the Prophet Muhammad, but also with his father's other wives, his difficult paternal grandmother, Mami, whom Baha'u'llah complained about in his diaries for her mean temper, always screaming, yelling, and fighting, and a nanny, Nosob, with whom he was especially close. Given the intricate dynamics of multiple wives, Rumi had both siblings and half-siblings. His older brother, Alauddin, was born to Rumi's mother 2 years before him. He also had an older married sister, Fatim, and at least one half-brother, Hossein. Rumi was the youngest, as his father was already in his early 50s when he was born. According to Baha'u'llah's diaries, he was living with his family in Waksh on the banks of the Waksh River in present-day Tajikistan when Rumi was born on September 30, 1207. Both vital water source and geographical marker for this somewhat obscure town, the Waksh River flowed down from the Pamir Mountains, dubbed the roof of the world by the Persians. replenished by glaciers, then cut its way nearly 500 miles southward to disappear into the broader river whose name it vaguely echoed, the Oxus. The Oxus served as a vast natural divide in Central Asia, now the border between Tajikistan and northern Afghanistan, or in Rumi's time between Transoxania, the lands beyond the Oxus, and Greater Khorasan, the eastern half of the old Persian Empire. Vakhsh was a modest one-mosque town, memorable for its stone bridge spanning a deep gorge of the river. The entire valley remained true to its description by one Muslim geographer as very fertile and famous for its fine horses and sumpter beasts, having many great towns on the banks of its numerous streams where cornlands and fruit orchards gave abundant crops. Its soft green fields were filled with willow and mulberry trees, and irises and crocuses in spring. Beyond Vakhsh to the mountainous north and east, in the direction of China were trade routes, where caravans descended, bringing slaves to market, as well as musk, the aroma of male deer, a coveted ingredient in perfume, synonyms in Rumi's poetry with spiritual awakening, your sweet scent. When asked in future travels about their origins, Rumi's family tended to say that they were from Balkh, the capital of the Balkh region, of which Vakhsh was an outpost on the southern shore of the Oxus River in modern-day Afghanistan, and so the phrase al-Balkhi became yet another tag attached to Rumi. This better-known city helped fix them on the map, as Balkh, known by the Arabs as Mother of Cities, was one of 4 capitals of Khorasan, its rounded central town with over 24 mosques fortified by triple-gated walls, its markets stocked with oranges, lilies, and sugarcane. Living in Vakhsh between 1204 and 1210, Baha'u'llah still claimed ties to the metropolis, as Rumi's great-grandfather led Friday prayers and gave the official sermon in one of its largest mosques. Rumi matured into the boldest of believers in the oneness of the religion of lovers, and few areas could have offered his nurturing, if regularly violent, an experience of religious diversity as Central Asia in these early years of the 13th century. Fittingly, he came of age on the edge of several cultures, several languages, and many living faiths. As he insisted, if he is Turk or Tajik, I am close to him. In the vicinity of Balkh, for instance, were the ruins of a Zoroastrian fire temple, its priests known as Magi, which had itself converted from a Buddhist monastery. Zoroastrianism was the imperial religion of the Persians before the Arab Muslim invasions of the 7th century. Rumi noticed, a bit subversively, in a later poem, the quality of divinity to transcend divisions when he wrote, "Why is divine light glowing in this Magi temple?" The adult Rumi liked to tell his students of a mystic Sufi of Balkh, so used to bolting upright at the call to prayer that on his deathbed, when he heard the chant wailed from the minaret, he stood. Recurring in his poems too was Ibrahim ibn Adam, the so-called Buddha of Balkh, an 8th century Muslim prince who earned his epithet by giving up his kingdom for a life of poverty and traveling off towards Mecca and Syria. Joyful Prince Ibn Adam rode his horse away, turning that day into a great king of justice. The rising smoke of Zoroastrian holy fires, Buddhist renunciation, and the colorful mystics of Balkh all show up faintly in Rumi's later poetry, like a palimpsest of his childhood in Central Asia, registering the different influences he assimilated naturally. Rumi looked to his father with the admiring and idealizing eyes of a young boy, and strikingly continued to exhibit that attitude well into adulthood. Baha'u'llah was the single most important influence on his son during the first half of his life, not only emotionally, but spiritually and intellectually as well. As a little boy, Rumi would watch as his father stood and repeated over and over, Allah, 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 as he himself would pray as a grown man, in a loud voice during the long nights, his head resting against a wall. He so devotedly studied and recopied his father's personal meditations, written during their time in Vakhsh, that he was able to recite large prose suites by heart. Yet Baha'u'llah was more complex than the figure idolized by his son, and as his diaries revealed, more transparently human. Tall, big-boned and strong, he was a compelling argumentative figure, full of great spiritual longing and honest outpourings, but also susceptible to tremendous pride and ambition. Rumi once told his students a story of Baha'u'llah, so rapt at the set time for prayer that he had forgotten to turn his prayer rug to Mecca. Two of his pupils paid him the ultimate respect of continuing to face his back rather than turning their own rugs in the proper direction. Adoringly, Rumi concluded that his pious father had been the light of God. His father did inspire such feelings, but for some, especially during his years in Welsh, he could also arouse dismissive ire. Baha'u'llah's main work was as an occasional preacher, as well as a Sunni jurist, grounded in the moderate Hanfi school of law that allowed for personal reasoning and decision-making. Popular in Central Asia, the Hanfi approach was followed by his family, and eventually by Rumi. As Baha'u'llah was not the main preacher at the mosque, he did not deliver the Friday sermons as his more celebrated grandfather had in Balkh. Instead, he spoke on weekdays and taught a circle of young men to whom he was committed for spiritual direction. He was strict and insisted on fasting, proper washing before the daily ritual prayers, and teething for the poor. When a group of local Sufis slept in the sanctuary to be closer to God, Baha'u'llah lectured them the next day on the commonsensical virtues of a good night's rest at home, rather than pursuing such bliss. Sufism was the mystical branch of Islam, and while Baha'u'llah was close to the Sufis in many of his spiritual practices, teachings, and writings, he was not publicly identified simply as a Sufi, and could be more insistent on keeping to religious rules and regulations. Each morning, Baha'u'llah sat in the mosque, flattered by the respectful salams of the worshippers. He passed some of the rest of his day walking the streets, engaging with the townspeople. He advised the town clown to become a vegetable peddler, so that he might live a more honest life and become pure and sincere. He spoke with the local astrologer about the limits of his predictions, and with the silk weaver about the power of the Islamic prophets. He spent enough time in the bazaar to be able to tell yellow Baghdad glass from crimson Samarkand and the round crystal flasks of Bukhara, or to consider the merits of violet root with sugar over crushed bird lime for a stomachache. He watched as villagers picked mulberry leaves to feed their silkworms to make cocoons. The current events and issues of Central Asia all filtered through Baha'u'llah's alert theological intelligence as he shifted for morals and lessons. Temple statues of Hindu deities, dragons, snakes, scorpions fascinated him, as he wondered if a graphic illustration of a thief with his head stuck in the mouth of a fiery dragon, or a traitor eaten by a snake, frightened Hindus enough to prevent them from practicing vices. He was disturbed to learn of an ancient clitoridectomy initiation practiced on women in Muslim Turkic tribes in the Khotan region of China, though his horror over the ceremony mostly concerned the scandal of uncovered women, public lovemaking, and wine drinking. Baha'u'llah possessed a healthy sexual appetite, both a delight and a challenge. Waking up one dawn to the sound of a barking dog, his eyes fell on his wife, Bibi Alvi, perhaps a pet name for Rumi's mother, and aroused by her, he wondered, this arousal was also caused by God, so why did I have a feeling of torment and distraction? Another wife put him in mind of the virgins of paradise. Maybe, like the morning, I had a sensation when I was embracing the daughter of Judge Sharaf and kissing her lips, and joyfully holding her, I saw that her skirt was rolling up like a little girl's. She kept saying, "Oh God," the same God who at the moment made my spirit happy. He reconciled any conflict over being distracted from God by feminine sensuality, unusually when he wrote, "Embrace God, and God will hug you to his bosom and kiss you." Yet Baha'u'llah was pained by the limits of small-town life, and beneath the pleasures of the daily round, he chafed at his rank. He experienced Baksh as an exile. His conviction of his importance in the spiritual scheme of things did not match his post at a minor mosque. I began to wonder, why Baksh? He went it in his journal. Others are in Samarkand or Baghdad or Balkh or other glorious cities. I'm stuck in this bare, boring, and forgotten corner. And he confessed misgivings that he knew revealed a lack of a deep faith. Sometimes I feel as if I'm a king without a kingdom, a judge without authority, a man of position without a position, and a wealthy man without any money. Baha'u'llah backed up his sense of destiny with the grand title that he attached to his signature, Sultan al-Ulama, or King of the Clerics. Supposedly, this title came to at least one of his friends and students in a dream. In this shared dream, a radiant old man stood on a hill and called out, "King of the clerics," to Baha'u'llah, inviting him to make his true status known to the whole world. A eunuch servant from Merv told him of a similar dream of his exaltation and of crowds shouting in acclamation. And a Turk dreamed of him leading hundreds in Friday prayer. Yet when Baha'u'llah used his lofty title to sign a fatwa or legal ruling by a religious scholar on questions of Islamic jurisprudence, the judge of Vakhsh dismissively crossed it out. Baha'u'llah had a number of exalted enemies, if only in his own mind. One was Khwarazm Shah, the ruler of much of Khorasan, after his conquests of 1204. Baha'u'llah labelled him a religious deviant, an insult that might have explained his unimportant post in Vakhsh, if expressed publicly. Even more heated was his dislike of the king's favourite preacher, Fakhruddin Razi of Herat, whose preaching the king so loved that he stationed a representative in regal gold cap and belt, as a seal of approval at the foot of any pulpit where Razi appeared. Baha'u'llah did not hide his envy when a friend described being present when Razi, known for bringing his congregation to tears, spoke with barely enough room for the many listeners who entered to hear him, all bearing candles. Yet Baha'u'llah's aversion was not only a matter of petty jealousy. Known by the title Chief of the Skeptics, Razi used his defense of reason and science, which made him a famous scholar, as well in a vendetta directed against Sufiists and other mystics. To convince Khwarazm Shah, Razi once staged an elaborate hoax. He dressed the king's stablemen in Sufi robes, surrounded with extras, posing as disciples. When the king solicited their spiritual advice, Razi exposed his prank, illustrating the potential for charlatanism in such claims. The lesson stuck, as Khwarazm Shah ordered a leading Sufi drowned in the Oxus a decade later, an obvious threat to men such as Rumi's father. When he later wished to personify reckless use of power, Rumi, in poems and talks, reached back to Khwarazm Shah and, as the very symbol of intellect befuddled by logic rather than love, Razi. The two men his father classified as useless philosophers, comparing them to locusts. Some consolation to both father and son was Razi's change of heart as he neared death in 1209. The skeptic had dramatically reproached himself for devoting his life to logical sciences that did not lead to truth. In a deathbed testament, Razi admitted that he had studied philosophical methods. But I have not found in them either satisfaction or comfort, to equal which I have found in reading the Quran. Rumi made a vignette of this deathbed scene from his childhood in Book 4 of his Masnavi. That philosopher, on the day of his death, saw intellect as a tree with no fruit or leaves. Baha'u'llah was hardly averse to conflict, and spent hours and piled up hundreds of manuscript pages settling such scores. If his son had not heard rants against Razi as a boy, he could have relived them by reading later. Yet he also had a remarkably soft core, a delicacy of sentiment, as he expressed musings, prayers, and dreams, which revealed hints of an extraordinary spirit. He loved music and visualized his prayers as songs played singly by a small-stringed, violin-like rabab, tambourine and flute, and then by all three. Awaking one morning, he imagined himself as a tree, beginning to branch with eyesight, to flower with feelings, to bear fruit with prayer, and to touch the skies with language. Cutting a loaf of bread, he retraced in his mind its cycle from wheat to grist to oven. He recorded a dream of learning the secret language of a flock of large white flying birds. This journal was Baha'u'llah's most durable gift to his son. After his father's death, when Rumi was in his mid-20s, he was emboldened to listen for internal guidance by the divine messages included in the manuscript, such as Baha'u'llah's record of fears of failure, revealed by the voice of God to be in fact a test of his fortitude. As he had transcribed into his journal, God inspired me with this thought: if you are with me, I will be your companion. You won't be in any one place, not Vakhsh, nor Baghdad, nor Samarkand. You won't be with anyone, nor will you be outwardly adorned. Rumi also borrowed material from his father. Baha'u'llah's commentary on a passage in the Quran on the 4 birds God uses to prove to Abraham that he can resurrect the dead is spun in the Masnavi into over 1,000 lines on the duck of greed, rooster of lust, peacock of pride, and crow of avarice. Inherited, too, was his bold and confessional voice, an intimate yell. Baha'u'llah experienced a midlife crisis in Vakhsh, and his articulation of its dark nights remained vibrant. I will be 55 years old on the first day of Ramadan. I've heard my lifespan will be another 10 years, since the average lifespan is 60 to 70 years. When I added up 10 years, I found that would amount to 3,600 days. I want to be sure to spend those 3,600 days in the best way, remembering the splendor and greatness of God. The dominant force in his son's emotional and even literary development, Baha'u'llah, was not Rumi's sole influence, though, as the world of Khorasan was rife with stimulation for a boy with an active imagination and an early curiosity about matters spiritual and heroic. Trances and the supernatural were popular elements in the storytelling culture that filtered through Vakhsh and Balkh, both for entertainment or, when shared by wandering holy men, for moral wisdom. Fantastical tales were retold, embroidered and exchanged among Rumi and his friends. Favorites were stories of good and evil genies, demons and angels, as well as the exploits of legendary kings and princes, judges and warriors. Within earshot, too, were teasing riddles, jokes, and obscene remarks or curses that were particularly colorful. Even as an adult, Rumi could startle by occasionally letting fly with the common Khorasani insult, "You brother of a whore." The most persistent of these boyhood spells was cast on Rumi by the animal fables of friendship and betrayal, collected in the famed tale collection Khalil and Them, named for its vivid pair of squabbling jackals. Dating back at least as far as the ancient Sanskrit Panchatantra, these enchanting tales were translated in the 6th century into Pahlavi Persian and then into early modern Persian in the 11th century by Nasrullah as the Fables of Bidpai. The stories had such force that when the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad conceived an ambitious project to translate the Greek and Persian classics into Arabic, Khalil and Dem was among the first, an edition popular in Rumi's time. The Arabic and Persian collections hung on the pretext of a Sasanian emperor hearing rumors of the existence of an ancient book of wisdom for rulers hidden at the court of an Indian king, and dispatching his learned physician to surreptitiously copy down its stories with the help of a wise sage. The tales often cleverly opened up into other tales within tales. Animating all the plot trickery is a bestiary of scampering cognizant species. A hare outwits a lion, luring him to dive into his own reflection in a well. A crow shuttles a mouse, nearly trapped in the nets of a hunter, to the safety of a tortoise pond. Rumi showed how avidly he absorbed these stories when he revisited them in the last 2 decades of his life while composing his Masnavi, described by one literary scholar as a grand storybook. Early in Book 1, he unrolls its tale of the crafty hare outwitting a powerful and arrogant lion in nearly 500 lines of verse, baldly introduced. Go ask Khalil about that story and seek out the moral there. In Rumi's adaptation, the story transforms into a debate on faith and works. In Book 2 appears the fox from Khalil, tearing down a hollow drum hanging from a tree branch, believing its rattling in the wind is the sound of an edible pig. In Book 4, the 3 great fish of Khalil, one wise, one clever, one stupid, meet differing outcomes at the hook of the fisherman, with a caveat from Rumi that his storytelling is strategic. You must have read the story in Khalil. That was the husk, this is the kernel. The cautionary tale of the 3 fish leads him to meditate on wisdom as a solitary path, as the surviving fish had figured out his escape on his own, through independent thinking. The other monumental storyline for Persian-speaking adults and children, especially in Khorasan, was set in marble in the epic Shahnam, or the Book of Kings, written in the 11th century by Ferdowsi in the rhythmic couplet Masnavi form that Rumi would use for his own spiritual epic. A mythologized history of the Persians From creation until the toppling of the Sassanid dynasty, the poem is set in the land of Rumi's birth. Like Greece and Troy in the Iliad, the opposing sides in this heroic tale, which is described in the Shahnameh's second third, are Turan in Transoxania and Iran, already another name for Persia and Khorasan, with the river Oxus as the divide between the two fighting clans. At a climactic moment, the Iranian king Khosrow rides his black stallion across the Oxus to the amazement of a boatman who exclaims, "No one has ever seen horsemen in full armor crossing the river in the height of spring." Rumi's imagination was filled with the kings and princes of Shahnameh, its fathers and sons. In his lyric poems, the mythic fourth king of the world, Jamshed, again sets the world on fire, and he evokes the evil Sahak, snakes coiled on each shoulder. Anywhere you find anger, you will also see pride. If you're happy with these snakes, turn into Sahak. Rumi was most smitten with Rustam, son of Sal, who excelled Hercules-like at completing 7 labors while riding his mighty steed Raksh. In the tragedy at the heart of the poem, a reversal of Oedipus' Rex, Rustam unknowingly kills his son in battle. Rustam was to become his epitome of the spiritual hero, comparable to Joseph or Ali. When the perfume of your grace arrives, all Sals become Rustams, ready for battle. These heroes from Rumi's boyhood became familiar presences scattered throughout his work. Yet he was never nostalgic. He looked back on his childhood in Khorasan as a stage of development and learning to see through surface to meaning. To be a boy was to ask literal questions about how 2 jackals could speak or how a moon could fill an elephant with fear. As a man, his subject became meanings inside and mature heroism. The hero gives a wooden sword to his son until he learns to use a real battle sword. Human love is a wooden sword until he learns to battle hurt with mercy. Between 1210 and 1212, Baha'u'llah finally resolved to leave Vaksh. His motives might have been political. The cities and towns of Transoxania were forever being sequestered and reclaimed and shifting territorial allegiances, mostly between the Khwarazm Shah and other dynasties, such as the Ghurids, from a central province in Afghanistan. The king of Ghur ruled in Vaksh during at least part of the stay of his family. When this king came to town in 1204 to settle a policy dispute with the minor vizier, Baha'u'llah remained neutral, invoking uncertainty about the ultimate will of God. Yet Baha'u'llah did not need an excuse to abandon Vaksh. Near the end of his family's stay in the town, he worked through his ambivalence about making a move westward. He worried about leaving friends and securing a stable living situation for his mother. Taking into account his age and chronic diabetes, he wrote, "It occurred to me, I am sick and am in no state to travel, for I have always stayed in a fixed place. What should I do?" Eventually, he felt as if he received direction through prayer and grew resolved. God gave the inspiration. If you want to travel and to gain insurance, begin to go, little by little, in heat and in cold, every day, and then return home until you get used to it. Baha'u'llah did lead his family out of Khorasan in half steps. Their first destination was Samarkand, one of the enviable 3 cities on his wish list. After their departure from Vaksh, or later from Samarkand, or perhaps both, they halted in Balkh. Yet clearly when they left humble Vaksh, travelling little by little, the family of Baha'u'llah, and certainly their youngest son Rumi, did not know they were embarked on a perpetual journey, with no fixed conclusion that would last nearly 2 decades, and constitute a grand, if not always voluntary, tour of the vital Muslim civilizations of the Middle East. Chapter 2. Samarkand. While still a boy no more than 6 years old, Rumi, around the year 1212, travelled with his family to Samarkand. Located only 150 miles northwest of Vaksh in modern-day Uzbekistan, this most fabled capital of Central Asia would have been reached most directly by his father's caravan crossing the Zurfshan mountain range into a region ruled by the Karkhanids, one of the Turkic dynasties in the region vying for its control. In Rumi's later poems, such Turk warriors were often romantically frozen in time, nomadic on the steppes and riding wild horses, as in one of his Ramadan poems. Inside this month is a hidden moon, hidden like a Turk inside the tent of fasting. Yet, by the time Baha'u'llah and his family arrived in Samarkand, their new Turk rulers, like many such roving clans, had long ago abandoned their ancient shamanic practices for more urbane and cosmopolitan lives, while adopting as well the Sunni Islam of their subjects. Samarkand was certainly the grandest, busiest, and most eclectic city the boy had yet witnessed, even more so than Balkh because of its crucial location at the crossing of several important trade routes, bringing traders and their curious goods from farther away. Samarkand was also at a poetic crossroads, one of the cities where innovative poems were first composed and sung a couple centuries earlier in the Persian his family spoke, rather than a more ancient classical form. Samarkand tasted and sounded sweet to the young Rumi, though he would also experience within its walls some of the dark tumult released by the historical forces into which his family was now unwittingly travelling. The first glimpse of Samarkand for any caravan crossing the Zarafshan River and making its way through surrounding peach orchards and tall cypress trees, irrigated by numerous canals, was the impressive Shahrastan, the old district commanding the highest ground above the city bulwarks, built in clay in pre-Muslim times. Circular in the Persian manner and protected by a round wall, Shahrastan could only be entered through one of the four royal gates. The China Gate to the east, with its many terraced steps, led down to the river. Visible everywhere were lead pipes and stone supports carrying water to most of the homes in the markets. Arsing overhead was the expansive pale blue sky, described by one Syrian traveller, with the memory perhaps tinted by nostalgia, as perpetually clear. Rumi's family likely settled in a more modest but popular neighbourhood nestled below the promontory along the riverbank, flooded sometimes in spring when mountain snows thawed, just south of the Kish or Great Gate. This new or almost suburban area was protected by its own 7-mile semicircular wall, which was pierced by 8 gates. Here were clustered most of the wood and clay brick houses of an estimated 100,000 families, so many with gardens that a guard looking down from the fortress of the citadel might not see any buildings at all, just brick minarets and a forest of trees. Cutting through the district were flagstone streets converging onto a great marketplace, Ras al Taq, in the square that connected the neighbourhood to the old city of Shahrastan. 50 years later, Rumi would faintly evoke this largely merchant neighbourhood in the opening story of the first book of the Masnavi, the tale of the goldsmith of Samarkand, told not simply as a spiritual parable, but also with a feel for the texture of its setting, the sense of place that comes from being a resident rather than a mere visitor. The story turns on a pretty slave girl adored by a much older king. As she remains so wan and unresponsive to his advances, the king dispatches his trusted physician to diagnose the problem. Cleverly, the royal physician, taking her pulse, asks leading questions until a quickening occurs at the mention of sweet Samarkand and of her own abduction from her beloved there. Her pulse was beating normally and evenly until he asked about Samarkand, sweet as sugar. Her pulse quickened, her face turned red and white. She had been carried off from a man of Samarkand, a goldsmith. As the physician uncovered the secret of her illness, the source of all that pain and misery, he asked, "Where is this street, and which way?" She answered, "By the bridge at Ghatafar Street." Ghatafar Quarter, with its small bridge, was located in the market district near Kish Gate, fitting for a goldsmith. And the couplet offers a rarity in Rumi's verse, an address. The casting of his main character as an artisan was not apt for just the neighbourhood of Ghatafar, but for all Samarkand, where commerce was king. Rumi would later include lots of imagery of bazaars piled high with products, drawn mostly from Konya. He was taken by the bazaar as a symbol of the seductions of material life, sensuous, though finally evanescent. Yet during the time his family visited Samarkand, the immense square of Ras al Taq, just steps away, offered exposure to shopkeepers and artisans more lavish than anything he might ever again have known. Throughout the city, but especially near its chief bazaar, 2,000 stations were set up for obtaining iced water, kept chilled in tiled fountains, copper cisterns, or clay jugs. In spite of some of the stricter rules of Islam against representation, lifelike statues of animals had once been arranged about the square as a folly, as recorded by one 10th century geographer. Astonishing figures are cut out of cypresses of horses, oxen, camels, and wild beasts. They stand opposite the other, as though surveying each other, and on the eve of engaging in struggle or combat. Still milling in Ras Al Tak in the evenings by oil lamplight were storytellers, snake charmers, and backgammon players. Samarkand products carried mystique, looms spun red and silver cloth as well as brocades and raw silk. Coppersmiths hammered gigantic brass pots. Craftsmen fashioned stirrups, harnesses, and goblets. Farmers grew walnuts and hazelnuts. Famous worldwide was Samarkand's silk paper, originally a product of China. Handmade from the bark of mulberry trees, the smooth paper dyed in many colors using henna, rosewater, or saffron, had a sheen almost tactile in the sheets scattered throughout Rumi's poems, as he exclaimed, "Spread out the paper and break the pen. The wine server has arrived." Still being sung in Ras Al Tak Square when Rumi was growing up were the odes of Rudaki, lovingly recorded in those sheets of fine Samarkand paper. This 10th century innovator in New Persian poetry, the language and style in which Rumi would write all his works, was born in a small village near Samarkand. Rudaki became one of the first to write poetry in modern Persian, its alphabet in phonetic Arabic script, very close to contemporary Farsi, rather than ancient Pahlavi Middle Persian ideograms. He had begun by versifying tales from Khalil and them, and went on to compose in all genres used by Persian poets from then on. Rudaki was said to have invented the Rubai Qutran form based on a jingle he heard chanted by children as they were rolling walnuts down the streets of Bukhara, the nearby twin city of Samarkand, famous for its library and twinned by Rumi in his poetry too. Sugar comes from Samarkand, but his lips found sweetness in Bukhara, so he stayed. Rudaki's lyrics remained humming in Rumi's mind throughout his life, like the songs of childhood. Sometimes he borrowed lines directly, taking a half line from Rudaki's elegy about a friend for his own elegy, for the mystic poet Sanai. The death of a great man is no small matter. The most famous of Rudaki's poems was a ballad composed to convince the king to return home to his court in Bukhara after summering in Herat, lured by a wide variety of grapes for fine wine. As the story went, by the last strum of Rudaki's lyre, the king had already mounted his horse for the return trip. Now stirs the scent of the Mulian brook, Rudaki sang, the memory of dear friends. Rumi adapted the line, giving a more romantic and spiritual sense to its longing for home and companions. Now stirs the scent of garden and gardener. Now stirs the scent of the beloved friend. Not all of Rumi's memories of Samarkand, though, were filled with melodic odes and lively marketplaces. Soon after his family's arrival, still around 1212, he had his first brush with a frightening siege by none other than his father's nemesis, Khwarazm Shah, who felt ready and powerful enough to annex this most attractive of the capitals of Central Asia. Using as his excuse the supposed mistreatment of his daughter, one of the wives of the Karakhanid ruler, he massed soldiers at the city walls and conducted an aggressive 3-day siege. This was Rumi's earliest recorded memory, and he relived the events years later in a talk to his students, dwelling on the plight of a lady he remembered watching, and interpreting the scene in retrospect with more than a boy's maturity. We were in Samarkand and Khwarazm Shah surrounded the city with his soldiers in ranks. In that neighborhood there was an extremely beautiful lady, without compare in the entire city. I kept hearing her say, "Oh God, how could you let me fall into the hands of tyrants? I know you would never permit such a thing. I trust you." They looted the city and were taking everyone captive, including the lady's maids, but nothing happened to her. Even though she was very beautiful, no one even looked at her. So you should know that whoever trusts in God will be safe from all harm. The onslaught was relentless enough for Khwarazm Shah to emerge as the new ruler of Samarkand and fierce enough for him to live on in Rumi's poetry for his weaponry and violence. The world is an arrow, and the tongue the bow of the Khwarazmians. Any victory for Khwarazm Shah marked a setback for Baha'u'llah, yet no record exists of the family fleeing Samarkand or even leaving soon afterward. The change of power at the top was assimilated by a city well used to such shake-ups. Life went on, and in some ways the city became even more lustrous, as Khwarazm Shah memorialized his victory by building a cathedral mosque and a lofty edifice of a palace. The impression left by Samarkand in the poetry of Rumi was certainly warm, tender, and nostalgic, a wide-eyed appreciation shared by many other Persian poets. Join together the fractured bits of your intellect with love, so you may become as sweet as Samarkand and Damascus. He often talked about his entire homeland as Khwarazm, which included Samarkand, now subsumed within Khwarazm and more than once remarked on its beautiful people. Someone said, "No one falls in love with Khwarazm. There are so many beauties that as soon as you see one and become infatuated, you see another even more beautiful and forget all about the first. If you don't dare fall in love with the beauties of Khwarazm, better fall in love with Khwarazm itself, which has many inner beauties." He associated both the city and his homeland with this inner beauty, outlasting even the striking beauty of the people on its streets, and holding a quality heartfelt and enduring. By the time of the siege of Samarkand, 6-year-old Rumi was old enough to attend one of the maktabs, or elementary schools, attached to the local mosques. While no sure record exists of Rumi enrolled in any of the maktabs of Samarkand, stories of him as a pupil in learned settings come from Sharafuddin Samarkandi, an eminent citizen of the city, as well as a follower of Baha'u'llah. Sharaf liked to tell of Rumi as a 9-year-old, 3 years after the siege of Khwarazm Shah, asking tricky questions of the local scholars, but being too polite to contradict his elders when they were mistaken. He went to exaggerated lengths in respecting the religious scholars, Sharaf reported. Sharaf's wife was also devoted to Baha'u'llah, and first taught Rumi a juvenile version of Sama, meditating while listening to poetry and music, though he only went as far as waving his hands about. Whether Rumi's knowledge of maktab schooling came from Samarkand, Balkh, or elsewhere, the experience of this early education was nearly standard throughout Khwarazm, as the curriculum was controlled through the network of mosques. Most subjects were related back to the knowledge needed for better reading the Quran. Here, Rumi would have learned the technique for properly intoning the holy book and studied the lives of the prophets and sayings of caliphs, imams, and companions of the Prophet Muhammad. Many proverbs were set to verse for easy memorizing, yet language, mathematics, and science were taught as well. As with Quranic proverbs, Arabic lessons were versified into catchy lines matching Arabic terms with Persian definitions, including vocabulary from astronomy or geography. The popularity of such maktab schools helped explain the high literacy rates of the medieval Islamic world, said to have surpassed medieval Europe. Like love and religion, school for Rumi was blurred into the world according to his father. In the Masnavi, Rumi draws a naturalistic scene of a mother and father quarreling over sending their son to school. The mother wants her child to stay home. That anxious mother complains to her husband, "My child has grown thin from going to school." The disciplinarian father forces him to school, his tough love identified with the intellect. Stay away from that mother and her worries. A father's slaps are better than her sweet pastries. The mother is impulsive, the father noble reason. At first difficult, but finally 100 times easier. While still living in the harem with his mother when he began classes, and alert to the world of women, as indicated by his close observation of the plights of their female neighbor during the siege, Rumi aspired mostly to become a man exactly like his father. Traits of Rumi as a boy in school for the first time among other boys included many of the qualities to be expected, though with some surprises. He was a natural student and focused on his teachers, as might be expected of the son of a serious imam. He was also predictably precocious, the boy whose playmates were convinced he had disappeared to tour other realms with angels, stood out in a classroom setting. More surprising was a suggestion from the adult Rumi that he had been a bit of an unwilling student, perhaps even a prankster, and preferred his imaginative realms to the studious. When he was later teaching his own students, Rumi occasionally summoned his maktab memories for examples of model teachers. Rumi's father was a disciplinarian and a great believer in strict observance of protocol. Yet Rumi from an early age was drawn to kindness as the most effective teaching tool. Second only to Quranic recitation in elementary school had been handwriting lessons, a subtle skill with Arabic cursive script, and he recalled most fondly one penmanship teacher, clearly gentle in his pedagogy. At first, when the child shows his handwriting to the teacher, the letters are all slanted and wrong. But the teacher patiently and skillfully says to the child, "All the letters are good. You have written them very well. Very good, very good. You have only written this letter the wrong way. You should write it like this. And also, that letter is incorrect. It's like this." Rumi never bragged of any exceptional signs of adolescent intellectual power. Yet he did allow himself to etch a portrait of a boy in the third person that might well be understood as a self-portrait, a tactic he coyly used several times in the Masnavi. In a slight detour while writing a scene set in school, he meditated on gifted children, arguing the Sunni philosophical position that all minds are created different, against the claim of some philosophers that all minds are created equal, and that differences occur later because of education, a sort of nurture over nature argument. Rumi brings to life as his example a young prodigy, already wise beyond his years, self-possessed with a knowing manner. The opinions of a young boy without much experience in life may arise from thoughts that an old man full of years might never comprehend. Rumi's vignette has a knowing ring, and the boy he describes is recognizable in the anecdote passed down from Sharaf of the pupil, refuting the cleverly subtle scholars. In one of the funniest tales in the Masnavi, a group of boys in a maktab, hardly seeming to be entertaining thoughts beyond their years, plot how to escape the grind of work being assigned by a demanding teacher. One cunning pupil decides to use the power of suggestion to convince the instructor of an illness during the core maktab class of recitation of the verses of the Quran to learn to give each letter and vowel its due. The cleverest boy in the class made a plan to tell the teacher, "You look so pale. I hope you are well, but you've lost all color. I'm wondering if it's the weather or fever." The teacher began to have his doubts. Then the clever boy told another, "Do the same." After all 30 students express concern, the teacher hurries home and stays abed, shivering. Rumi's glee in the prank obviously came from siding with the students, and made believable an even more direct confession of his younger self resisting classwork. Your love of mother's milk didn't last. Your hatred of going to school didn't last. The heart of this education, though, for Rumi, both young and old, was the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, recited by the Prophet Muhammad in Makkah and Medina in the 7th century, as holy verses memorized and transcribed in mostly rhymed Arabic prose. The Quran was divided into surahs, or chapters, eventually arranged in order from longest to shortest. While Rumi could be comical or even rebellious about maktab lessons, he was never ironic about the Quran. Everything about the temperament and family of this sensitive child primed a mesmerized reader and listener. If his ears burned hearing the tales of jackals or lions in Khalil and Dem, the accounts in the Quran were narrative husks that included moral kernels. Later in life, he grew even more fascinated by the model of Muhammad, the ordinary merchant chosen as the messenger of the words of God put down in the Quran, whose personal qualities were nearly erased by divine inspiration, a window through which we can see the Creator. Over and over, the young Rumi heard the stories of prophets from the Quran that would form the raw material of his prayers, talks, and certainly poetry. Among his favorites were Abraham surviving Nimrod's fiery furnace without being burned, Noah, whose restive son dies in the flood, Joseph, so handsome some Egyptian women sliced their hands with their dinner knives while distractedly staring at him, Moses, whose rod turns into a serpent and swallows the magician's wands, Mary, giving birth beneath a palm tree that showers her with ripe dates, the baby Jesus, gifted with speech in his cradle and able to give life to clay birds with his breath. David, fashioning armor from iron chain links. King Solomon with his magic ring like Rumi's father in his dream, understanding the language of birds. The flames were obedient to Abraham. The waves bore Noah on their backs. Iron obeyed David and melted like wax, while winds were the slaves of Solomon. Rumi later imagined the Quran as a rich fabric brocade woven on two sides. Some enjoy the one side, some the other. Both are true. And he saw these two complementary sides as a woman, both a mother and a wife, supplying different needs. Her baby's pleasure comes from her breasts and her milk, that of the husband from enjoying intimacy with her. Some are children on the path and drink milk. These enjoy the external meaning of the Quran, unlike those who have become mature in understanding in a different way. The Masnavi unfolds with long stretches of probing philosophical questions raised by the Quran in sermonic style and in parsed couplets. Rumi could be precise and legal in his musings on free will or determinism, but other parts of the poem reveal a more immediate, childlike response to the Quran as a boyhood book of wonder. In one such story of the blind man in the Quran, a visiting sheikh is confused by the prominence of the scripture on a shelf in the home of a blind man. At night, he hears him reciting verses and rushes out to catch him in the act and to demand some explanation. Amazing with your blind eyes, you recite as if you see the lines. You have touched what you are reading. You put your finger on the very word. The blind man explains that when he went blind, he prayed to be able to read the Quran, as he was not a Hafiz who had memorized the entire book. God granted him sight for the sluices of time when he read verses, and then, like magic, his eyes snapped shut again. That peerless king restores for me my sight, like a lantern that brightens the dark night. During the decade between 1212 and 1221, and most probably in 1216, when Rumi was 9 or 10 years old, the camel caravan of the family of Baha'u'llah set out again, this time in the direction of Mecca, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad and holy city of Islam. A required pilgrimage destination for every Muslim in reasonable health, at least once in a lifetime. Theirs was a journey with no certain plan of return. All the accounts record their point of embarkation from Khorasan as Balkh, likely enough given the family history. To travel from Samarkand to Balkh, they simply would have needed to double back alongside the Oxus River. A natural crossing point to the Balkh side of the river was the fortress town of Termez, hometown of Rumi's tutor Borhan, who had decided to remain there. In his mid-40s, Borhan was Rumi's Lala, a tutor assigned the specific task of looking out for his well-being and spiritual education, and so was a warm and important figure in Rumi's boyhood, surpassed in influence only by his father. Borhan was later fondly remembered for always lifting Khudawankar on his shoulders and carrying him around. Rumi spoke of his tutor in the same glowing terms as he spoke of his father. Go, turn into pure light like Burhan-e-Muhakkik. And he remarked on his ability to IQ fine points well from his reading the masters. Borhan had become one of an intimate group of acolytes around Baha'u'llah, devoted to studying mystical practices in a sort of advanced seminar in prayers, visions, and dreams, which was not shared publicly. Of these practices, Borhan was particularly fanatic about fasting as a technique for self-discipline. In imitation of Baha'u'llah, he kept his own spiritual diary, where he wrote of the benefits of abstinence so that his body might become just like a glass through which the light of faith shines. Rumi quickly absorbed these cues. By age 6, he was supposedly able to sustain a fast as long as 3 or 4 days. So this sudden absolute separation from his Lala was not easy for the boy. Other separation caused by his father's decision to embark were equally difficult. Staying behind, most likely in Balkh, were his grandmother Mami, in her 70s, too aged for the rigorous and uncertain trip, his older half-brother Hussein, his half-sister Fatim, who stayed with her husband, and along with Borhan, the other figure Rumi missed most, looking back, his dear nanny Nosob. When he wished to stress the need to count solely on God, he evoked the loss of this nurturing pair from his young life. Closeness to anyone but God's untrue. Where now is the love of your nanny and your tutor? Only God is your true supporter. His eminent family friend and another mentor in his young life, Sharaf Samarkandi, had recently died. Another separation. Since Sharaf had been a man of means, his widow used the remaining family resources to travel on the pilgrimage too, with her daughter Gohar. Both mother and daughter would grow in importance to the family over the course of this journey. Baha'u'llah later said of the widowed, perfect saint, "My spiritual level and her spiritual level are the same." By the time they neared the end of their travels, nearly a decade later, Gohar had become Rumi's first wife. Whether paranoid or realistic, Baha'u'llah was always anxious about the risky politics of the region. While they were still living in Gooch, he feared that he would be imprisoned for his political opinions in an area far removed from his family and his followers, where no one could help him. During his time in Samarkand, the power of Khwarazm Shah had grown, and his influence was everywhere. On the eastern borders, the first threats from Mongols had been felt as early as 1211, as this Asiatic power made border skirmishes from China. So the practical concerns of Baha'u'llah interlocked well with the requirements of his religion to make a trip to Mecca. Baha'u'llah often wrote in his journal of yearning for quest and for movement. When God is taking your body and your soul from east to west. He would not have been disappointed in the larger caravan they now joined. In the first leg of their journey, as they trekked along the borders of Central Asia, countless other long trains of double hump Bactrian or single hump dromedary, camels and donkeys, were making their way across the deserts and plains ringed by snow-capped mountains, stopping in oasis towns surrounded by subtropical palm trees. Busy markets were crowded with merchants peddling melons or horses to travelers from a wide swathe of the unknown world. As Rumi would write when reaching to express geographical expanse, from Rome to Khorasan. As a boy, Rumi absorbed the rhythm of these camels as they traced their shuffling lines in grass and sand, dutifully following the lead of their drivers, who steered with pegs of wood inserted in the camels' noses, through which loops of rope were strung. He would later come to imagine himself as just such a camel, guided by reins held by love's hand, drunkenly pulling your load in ecstasy. And he came to know by heart the tunes permeating everywhere on the trip, sung to pass the time or quicken the pace. Accompanied at each stride by the jingle of silver bells fastened near their camels' ears, the drivers spontaneously broke into traditional songs, often love songs, only interrupted for the call to prayer. Most pronounced in these melodies was the ney or reed flute, an almost mournful Persian instrument that became for Rumi an image of his art and soul. Spaced a day's journey apart along the way were the caravanserai, outfitted with a well and stables for animals, a prayer room, a small bazaar, and a gallery of guest rooms around a central courtyard. In the colder mountains, these inns were built of stone, with roofed courtyards to keep out rain and snow. On the warmer plains, they were constructed of compacted earth or brick with open courtyards. Such inns always evoked for Rumi transience rather than comfort, as he passed through so many growing up. Yet the tenor of his writing about this juvenile time of travelling was positive. He was moving farther from any maktab school being taught by his father or others. And images of flutes and camels, caravans and inns, crescent moons and desert sands, along with the constant change, would eventually be compressed into his great theme of non-attachment. Our voices like the bells of a caravan, or thunder when the clouds are full. Traveller, don't leave your heart in the inn. Chapter 3. On the Silk Road. In the early stretches of their travels, Rumi's family followed simple roads that traced the shortest distance between 2 points. Yet, as their destinations became more distant, they joined into an elaborate network of trade routes that connected China, India, and Persia to the Mediterranean Sea. This well-kept system of major roads, inherited by the Arabs from the earlier Persian kingdom, radiated out of Baghdad and served both trade and religious purposes. Known in later centuries as the Silk Road, the route was actually neither. Silk was just one of its transported goods, which included everything from spices and fine glass to ammonium chloride for treating saddles, and the road, in outlying regions, broke into unmarked paths over deserts or steep mountains. Like other travelers from Balkh, Rumi's family would have followed a southern route that linked to the most trafficked of the trunk roads, the Great Khorasan Road, to Baghdad and Mecca, passing through Khorasan and continuing westward with the Great Desert to their south and the Tabaristan Mountains to their north. Eventually, they would have descended from the highlands of Persia to cross the Tigris River and enter Baghdad through its eastern Khorasan gate. From western Baghdad, the main pilgrim road then led on toward Mecca and Medina, crossing over the vast Arabian desert in a direct line. This journey, though, was as much inward as outward, even if Rumi was still such a young boy and much of its impact not fully realized for some time. He was seeing many fantastic sights by touring through the great Islamic cities of the day, yet he was even more crucially coming into contact with important clues to his poetic, cultural, and spiritual lineage, especially in Nishapur, Baghdad, and Mecca. Nishapur was the center of a vibrant scene of devotional poetry and mystics trading in scandal as a spiritual practice. Baghdad, the very nervous system of both Islamic university life and Sufism from its beginnings, as well as the seat of the Caliph, both Pope and King. In Mecca, Muslims of all ages came to reflect, once in a lifetime, on the relation of their souls to God, a matter of early concern to Rumi, as it was to his family. The man Rumi became would have been inconceivable without the pieces of his identity he discovered in this decade-long trip. Their first stop would have been Nishapur, near the northeast border of present-day Iran, where they likely arrived sometime in 1216, when Rumi was about 10 years old. Nishapur was the fourth of the large capitals of Khorasan, the most populous and the most western in location, a final outpost of the land of Rumi's birth. It was also a welcome respite on such a trip, as branch roads from Balkh were among the most meandering kind, less well kept than the broader routes leading into Baghdad, and so the family had just passed through long stretches of dusty badlands, a forbidding hideout for outlaws, with endless plains enlivened in spring only by a fuzz of green grass dotted with red poppies, domed adobe houses, and the tent camps of nomad shepherds. The resolve and health of Baha'u'llah would have been tested with such a rocky beginning, and the relative comforts of home and the maktab schools set in high contrast for the boy Rumi. In Nishapur in 1216 was the geographer and travel writer Yaqut, who visited many of the same cities as Rumi and his family, and often in the same year. He described the capital in the phase that would have been witnessed by the family of Baha'u'llah as still distressed in spots from the great earthquakes of 1145, followed in 1153 by a siege by Oghuz Turks, who captured and carried off their Grand Sultan, Sanjar the Seljuk. As an empire builder, Sanjar came to stand for powerful worldly rulers in Rumi's poems. Since I came into your shade, I am the sun in the sky. Since I became a slave of love, I am the Khan and the Sultan Sanjar. As with many of the cities he described in the florid style of the time, Yaqut still found fine marvels to catch his eye, praising especially the turquoise mines and the swift river of Nishapur, powering dozens of mills with the snow melting from nearby mountains. While Nishapur was not the most memorable or significant of places visited by Rumi's family, the city did offer its style of liberated, freewheeling spirituality and an equally novel and brilliant poetry scene, with both of which Rumi eventually revealed an affinity. Nishapuri mystics were distinctive enough to become labeled the School of Khorasan. Their most notorious members were followers of the Malamatiya, or Path of Blame. Camouflaging their actual piety, so as not to be deemed saintly, these brazen types walked the streets barefoot, appeared to drink wine, wore finely embroidered silks, and behaved as if sinful or crazy. Having witnessed urban frivolity in the squares of Samarkand at twilight, which may have been extreme for a boy from Vaksh, Rumi was likely exposed in Nishapur to these fools for God, behaving just as wildly, but as a spiritual practice. The Nishapuri poets, too, traded in scandal. Their most famous practicing master, Attar, was by then well into his 80s or even 90s, his finest works behind him, especially The Conference of the Birds, an inventive and vividly imagined tale of a flock of birds embarked on a quest in search of the divine. Fantastically plumed Simorgh perched atop the highest peak of the Elborz mountain range in northern Iran. Such a work was made to order for a boy such as Rumi. Its moral tale involved talking animals, like his favorite Khalil and the Simorgh had first appeared in all her majesty in the Shahnam. Rumi responded to its simple Arabic meter, which he later used in his own Masnavi. And the poem reflected much that was rich and captivating in the sensibility of Nishapur at this peak moment. During the family's stay, Baha'u'llah, with his son and Tao, was said to have found his way to the apothecary's shop run by Attar inside a crowded bazaar. Attar was a pen name, signifying an herbal druggist, apothecary, or even a perfume seller, as in Attar of Roses. Such a meeting was indeed possible, though Rumi never spoke in public of such a fateful audience with the great poet, arguably his favorite. Attar was apparently in Nishapur during the year of the family's visit. An arranged conversation between a visiting religious leader traveling from the eastern lands and versed in the language of dreams and visions would seem possible. The focus, though, should have been the elder dignitary, Baha'u'llah, not his little boy. As the story was told flatteringly by others, Attar, however, was more taken with Baha'u'llah's sensitive son. With great prescience, the poet intuited the future of the child standing before him and predicted to Baha'u'llah, "Your son will soon be kindling fire in all the world's lovers of God." As a gift, he handed the boy a copy of his Masnavi in couplets, his Book of Secrets. In this abstract reverie with a sage theme, Attar reveals that the secrets of the world are hidden near the throne of God, and discovery of these eternal verities is available only to those willing to lose their heads and drink the divine rosewater of meaning. With blessings bestowed, both father and son then walked off. This story clung to Rumi's reputation in later years because whether or not it actually occurred in the bazaar in Nishapur, it occurred in a realm of meaning, important to him and his followers. Rumi claimed in Attar a sort of father figure, a poet father, and came to venerate the unique Attar, always comparing himself diminutively or inventing puns playing on the scent of Attar or on his small perfume and apothecary shop. Whatever you want, you will find in Attar. His is the shop of the world, and there is no other. Rumi not only looked up to Attar as a poet, but he also accepted the poetic lineage Attar fashioned for himself. Like many poets in defense of their style, Attar found inspiration and a model to emulate in the past, and contrary poets to reject for following an unsatisfying muse. He chose as his own father figure poet Sanai, a poet of the previous generation from Ghazna, in present-day Afghanistan, the first court poet credited with giving up writing fawning odes for his patron so he could practice devotional poetry. Sanai's Garden of Truth, in 10 chapters, was the first spiritual Masnavi, a template for those to come, including Rumi's, its flat, deliberate rhymed couplets recited throughout Khorasan. Rumi's tutor Borhan had loved to pepper his conversations with its proverbs. The royal road leading your soul to God is nothing but the cleansing of the heart's mirror. Attar, following the later Sanai, bragged of never having written a panegyric for hire, and both freely mixed their spirituality with scandal in the mode of the flamboyant mystics of Nishapur. Sanai's most notorious poem, Satan's Lament, parodied once by Rumi, turned on the tricky notion of Satan as the true lover of God, impossibly jealous of Adam. In The Conference of the Birds, Attar's flock exchanges tales of unconventional passions, between, for example, a Muslim sheikh and a Christian lady, or Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna and his Turk male slave Ayaz. Rumi was definite about his deep literary and spiritual debt to these poets, and his son, Sultan Walad, later ascribed to his father the line, "Atar was the soul, and Sanai the eyes of the heart. I follow in the footsteps of Sanai and Atar." Rumi said as much when making clear his poetic and spiritual lineage for his students. Whoever deeply reads the words of Atar will understand the secrets of Sanai, and whoever reads the words of Sanai with belief will better comprehend my own words and will benefit from and enjoy them. The poet of the previous generation dismissed by Atar and by Rumi, or at least by his friend Shams of Tabriz, was Omar Khayyam, buried beside a garden wall a few miles outside Nishapur, where pear and peach trees scattered petals on his tomb. Celebrated as a mathematician and astronomer while alive, Khayyam also wrote seductive four-line quatrains compatible with short, pithy observations about life. Whether at Nishapur or Babylon, the leaves of life keep falling one by one. Yet the bracing wind of doubt and pessimism, including questioning whether an afterlife existed, that sweeps through these rubais disturbed the mystical Atar. In his Book of the Divine, Atar imagined a clairvoyant standing at Khayyam's grave, seeing the great intellectual bathing in his sweat for shame and confusion, having to admit his error. No story was ever told of Baha'u'llah and Rumi visiting the grave of Omar Khayyam. Nishapur was known not only as the gate to the east, the entrance to Khorasan, but also as the gate to the west. Having passed through that gate as two roads diverged just west of Nishapur, travelers such as Rumi's family would have then taken the more northern caravan route rather than the southern post road. This route led past Ray, near modern-day Tehran, and on to Baghdad. Along the way, Persian tunes gradually gave way to Arabic love songs as the caravans left behind the Persian towns where Farsi was spoken and headed toward the Arabic-speaking regions of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula. Of a life spent toggling between these two languages, Rumi wrote, "Speak Persian, though Arabic is more beautiful. Love speaks 100 different languages." When they passed beyond the outskirts of Persian-speaking Nishapur, Rumi's family forever departed Khorasan. He never again saw the beauties of his native homeland. As they were on the pilgrimage to Mecca, the family was also traveling to the center of the Muslim religious world. As important as land geography for 13th century Muslims for religious quadrants, the locations of these places within latitudes and longitudes of spiritual significance. All prayer rugs during ritual prayer were pointed in the direction or Qibla of Mecca. In Muslim cemeteries, usually located as in Baghdad, just outside the city gates, the deceased were often buried facing toward Mecca. A carved wall niche in all mosques indicated the alignment with the holy city. This Qibla, later reimagined with romantic devotion by Rumi, as the Qibla of the friend's face. Baghdad was constructed as a main entranceway to Mecca, the entire city roughly oriented toward the Qibla, as its Kufa gate was calibrated southwest in the direction of the holy city, leading to a pilgrim road. As with a succession of capitals, its geography also marked its political destiny. Muhammad's flight from Mecca to the hamlet of Medina signaled a shift from a lone prophet to a political leader, the beginnings of an Arabian theocracy. The first purely Arab Umayyad Caliphate ruled from Damascus in Syria, backed by the Arabian desert, the homeland of their best soldiers and nomadic kin. The Caliph, meaning deputy or successor, was the ruling descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The succeeding Abbasid Caliphate built Baghdad, a Persian name, meaning given by God, on the banks of the Tigris, in the 8th century, near the old Persian capital, Ctesiphon, closer to Central Asia and accessible to the non-Arab Muslims of Khorasan. Probably arriving in Baghdad in January or February of 1217, Rumi's family had missed the golden age of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. Its glamour had been at its most radiant during the reign of Harun al-Rashid in the 9th century. The prosperity of his capital city opulently conveyed in the Arabian Nights. Harun set up a court in the Persian imperial style and encouraged intellectual projects. Primitive Bedouin songs were transcribed and Greek scientific texts translated by Nestorian monks. The gardens of his Golden Gate Palace were plotted about a tree made of silver with mechanical singing birds, and beyond stretched a cosmopolitan city that included 3 pontoon bridges anchored by iron chains to either bank of the Tigris, plus thousands of ferry skiffs, a Christian district with churches and monasteries, public parks for horse racing and polo, a Persian sport, and a wild beast park with Indian peacocks. During the winter of 1217, Baghdad was a less coherent showplace of urban planning, with travel across town for Rumi's family probably made more difficult by a great flood. The Caliph al-Nasir had been ruling for nearly 40 years, striving to maintain the glories of the Baghdad of Harun, but without unified military power. The Caliph remained checked by Khwarazm Shah to the east and Seljuk Turks to the west. Yet he dealt effectively while cultivating his gardens and moving the palaces from Harun's round city to the eastern banks of the Tigris. The poet Khaqani, as he passed through Baghdad, swooned over the gardens as a paradise, comparing the Tigris to the Virgin Mary's tears. Medieval Baghdad was widely diverse and tolerant, with a few restrictions. Some caliphs decreed that non-Muslim women wear yellow or blue clothing and red shoes. Yet Christian neighborhoods were among the most popular in Baghdad, partly explained by the unofficial role of monks as bootleggers for abstaining Muslims, as they brewed and dispensed wine from their cloisters. On a rainy day, what a pleasure it is to drink wine with a priest, wrote one chronicler. Around the time of Rumi's visit, the geographer and travel writer Yaqut was quite taken with the Greek Nestorian church in the Deir al-Rum quarter, where he said crowds of Muslims came on festival days to stare at the young deacons and monks with their handsome faces and enjoy dancing, drinking, and pleasure-making. Rumi accumulated a personal geography, a poetic version of Yaqut's Dictionary of Countries, where the cities he visited were consistently pegged. Samarkand and Damascus were forever sweetness and light, Bukhara forever tied to the suspect logic of Greek sciences, on display in its renowned library, where the texts, stored in chests rather than on shelves, were delivered on request by the staff. Bukhara is a mine of knowledge, he wrote, adding a warning against just such knowledge elsewhere. Give up art and logic for amazement. Go towards humility, not Bukhara. As the center of the caliphate, Baghdad remained for him a symbol of justice and power. Your Baghdad is full of justice. Your Samarkand is full of sweetness. In one tale of Baghdad in the Masnavi, the ambitious wife of a Bedouin nomad convinces her husband to advance their fortunes by petitioning the caliph and bringing to him as a tribute the greatest and scarcest treasures in the desert, a jug of rainwater. The Bedouin's wife was not aware the Tigris, sweet as sugar, flows there, flowing through Baghdad like a sea, full of boats with nets full of fish. All our senses and perceptions are like a drop in that pure river. The joke was about the comic limits of human understanding of the unknown, especially the divinely ordained unknown. Rumi was impressed with the hot sun of Iraq, and the Tigris and Euphrates from then on joined the mighty Oxus on the map of his imagination. The Euphrates, Tigris, and Oxus would be bitter as the salty sea if they were not flowing. The family likely stayed in Baghdad for a month. By the 13th century, the city was full of khanaqahs, or Sufi lodges, often built next to cemeteries, appropriate for otherworldly yearning. Yet Rumi's father was said to have chosen instead to reside in one of the madrasas or colleges. On the western side of Baghdad, the terminus for caravans from Khorasan, at least 30 such religious colleges were located. He never publicly identified with Sufi lodges, and the college setting was deemed more appropriate for a jurist and preacher traveling with his family. In an important moment in his life, an emissary of the Seljuk Sultan of Konya supposedly heard a weekday sermon given by Baha'u'llah in a Baghdad mosque and reported back his favorable impression. If not in residence at Nizamiya College, Baha'u'llah would at least have toured this most magnificent university in the Islamic world, founded by the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk in 1065, over a century before Oxford or the Sorbonne. Providing free education in the Shafi'ite branch of Sharia law, this institute, with branches for research known as the Mother of Madrasas, was located near a wharf on the banks of the Tigris River, alongside the Great Tuesday Market Street of East Baghdad that led in a serpentine route around the walls of the palaces of the caliphs, and was funded by the state with generous stipends for professors, as well as for building and grounds maintenance. Babylonian willow trees provided shade, while date and dried fruit shelters plied their traders nearby. Even a casual stroll through Nizamiya College offered a sampling of the textures of academic life that would become familiar to Rumi during the studious years of his young adulthood. Following a student riot and fire years earlier, the college had been rebuilt and was again stirring with activity. The long open-fronted robes of the scholars debating one another in the porticos were often dusty and frayed, while more celebrated jurists, in the manner of Baha'u'llah's imagined rival Razi, were elegantly dressed and perfumed, their sharp beards trimmed and their large turbans tightly wound. In the Masnavi, Rumi pokes fun at one such scholar stuffing his academic turban with rags to make it appear bigger. The universal language of students bustling in the courtyards was Arabic, like Latin in Europe, the lingua franca for all scholarly discourse and writing. Most famously at Nizamiya, nearly 200 years earlier in the 11th century, the renowned scholar Muhammad al-Ghazali lectured in halls that were crowded with hundreds of students for 4 years, then apparently suffered a nervous breakdown and left Baghdad to wander the deserts of the Hejaz, near Mecca in Syria. Haunted by doubts about Aristotelian logic, he eventually entered a Sufi lodge, where he wrote his widely influential treatise on inner science, the revival of the religious sciences. In his lifetime, and Rumi's, the revival of the religious sciences was akin to a bestseller. Rumi would refer to al-Ghazali with respect, but his true passion was al-Ghazali's more radical and outrageous poet brother, Ahmad, sometimes credited with the dramatic turnaround of the older philosopher from logical analysis toward his more therapeutic religion of the heart. Ahmad had always been a highly visible Sufi in Baghdad, espousing mystical love in aphorisms in his well-known book, Savaneh, or Flashes, and rather notorious for meditating on the eternal while gazing on the face of a beautiful boy known as Shahadbazi, a controversial practice in Sufism. Ahmad liked to lay a rose before a comely face and contemplate the lovely pair alternately. Yet Rumi remarked on the diminution of Muhammad's intellect next to Ahmad's hot passion. Had he possessed just one atom of love like Ahmad, it would have been better. If Baghdad had lost a degree of its caliphal splendor by the time Rumi's family visited, the city was still a great laboratory of developing Sufism, as it had been for over the previous 4 centuries. While the plain woolen robes of the earliest Sufis, their name probably derived from Su for wool, for this near uniform associated them with Christian desert monks, the label Sufiya, rooted in the Arabic word tasawwuf, from which the English word Sufism is derived, was first applied to a mostly urban movement in 8th century Baghdad. As one modern scholar of Sufism has speculated, the term Sufi had a certain avant-garde or cutting-edge resonance among both renunciants and others. This hip quality facilitated its application to the new movement. Starting from simple notions of clean living in exile from the luxuries of civilization, following the example of Ibrahim ibn Adam, the Buddha of Balkh, Sufism exfoliated into a subtle theology, emphasizing a more intimate relation with God and the possibility of inner union or reunion with the divine. Sufis favored verses of the Quran that emphasized closeness and accessibility over the sheer transcendence of God. Especially beloved was the 15th verse of Surah 50. We indeed created man, and we know what his soul whispers within him, and we are nearer to him than the jugular vein. A chronicler of these early Sufis, appropriately enough, was Attar. Uninterested in writing yet another Lives of the Poets, he had retooled the genre as Sinai had lyric poetry. By compiling a Persian Lives of the Saints, such compilations of popular stories about holy figures had long been popular in Arabic. There he told of Rabia, the woman mystic of Basra, said to have torn through the streets with a torch in one hand and a jug of water in the other to burn down paradise and douse the fires of hell, so no one would love God solely for reward or punishment. He profiled Junayd, the glass seller who promoted a sober school of Baghdad, advising speaking in code, and is foiled by Azid Bastami, who inspired a drunken school of Sufism similar to the school of Khorasan, full of music and ecstasy. These stories were lore the boy Rumi either already knew or was now discovering. The climax to Attar's 72 life sketches was Mansur al-Hallaj, a larger-than-life drunken Sufi, brutally executed in Baghdad in 922. Attar blamed his death on his famed utterance, "I am the truth." Since truth was one of the 99 names of God in Islam, the claim was judged heretical. For his supporters, the statement indicated a complete annihilation of ego. The sister of Hallaj also caused a minor stir by walking the streets of Baghdad without wearing a proper veil. Attar told a gruesome tale of the martyrdom of Hallaj. The merciful saint was led to the gallows, where his hands and feet were cut off, while he smiled and prayed. His body was then burned and his ashes tossed into the Tigris. Rumi's Baghdad was a city of power, but sometimes that power was harshly wielded. In the world of Baghdad I cried out, "I am the truth," while that world was busy debating the words of Hallaj. Traveling to Mecca in 1217, Rumi's family would have needed to depart Baghdad by February at the latest. That year on the Muslim lunar calendar, the final month of the year, or Zul-Hajj, named as the month for the pilgrimage or Hajj to Mecca, the birthplace of Muhammad, began on March 11. The official ceremonies in Mecca took place during the first 2 weeks of this month. Muslims could make a little pilgrimage to the holy city at any time throughout the year, though without fulfilling the commandment to participate in the Hajj at least once in a lifetime. Incumbent on Hanafites departing from Baghdad, such as Baha'u'llah, was to first visit the grave of Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanfi school. His shrine was marked with a white dome where a charitable station was set up for feeding the poor. The first phase of their trip was then the 100-mile journey to join with pilgrim caravans departing from the squat brick city of Kufa. Caravans leaving Kufa took nearly a month to arrive in Mecca, a journey of over 1,000 miles across the Arabian Peninsula, through much of the modern-day Saudi Arabia, which included forbidding territories troubled by stifling heat, deadly winds, and clouds of black flies. The desert road stretching from Kufa to Mecca offered only water in wells or cisterns, and an occasional underground canal. Absent were the caravanserais stationed along the Khorasan road. Pilgrims remained in caravans at night without the protection of walls, or they continued traveling in the dark. As Rumi later embroidered, a man traveling with a caravan on a dark, overcast night does not know where he is, how far he has traveled, or what he has passed. At daybreak he sees the results of the journey, that is, he will have arrived at some place. Likewise, whoever labors for the glory of God is never lost, though he shut both his eyes. While Rumi had many experiences with caravans to draw on, his more extreme memories of fears faced during travel were consistent with tales told of going on Hajj in medieval times. He spoke of travelers attacked in one spot, piling a few stones on top of each other as a marker, as if to say, "This is a dangerous place," and his evocation of caravans in desolate terrain conveyed the menace for a child of many imaginary threats. Say there is someone in a caravan on a dark night. He is so afraid that he constantly imagines that bandits are attacking the caravan. He wants to hear and recognize his fellow travelers' voices. When he hears their voices, he feels safe. The greatest threat was marauding Bedouin tribes that raided caravans. By day, these Bedouins tried to sell hungry travelers meat, milk, and cheese. Yet even in daylight, the journey was filled with the potential for accidents and sudden catastrophe. The Spanish geographer Ibn Jubair, traveling to Mecca 30 years before Rumi's family, witnessed a roadside stop where 7 pilgrims had been trampled to death in a rush on a water tank used by men and camels. Rumi compared these travails to spiritual efforts. The glory of the Kaaba and its gathering is proved when pilgrims braved Bedouins and traveled the wide desert. Once within the sacred zone of Mecca, the basic rituals of Hajj had remained constant over the centuries, though political control of the region shifted. One local ruler during this period mistreated pilgrims from Baghdad to display his power in a feud with the caliph. While the majority of pilgrims were males, their families and single women also took part. Men and boys wore the pilgrim's robe, 2 sheets of white cloth secured by a white sash with sandals. women wore modest dress and hijab. The core event was walking 7 times counterclockwise around the Kaaba, the granite cube that stood at the center of the Islamic world, the vanishing point of Qibla, so that, as Rumi wrote, when you're inside the Kaaba, you don't need to face in any direction. Especially cherished was the black stone affixed by Muhammad in the Kaaba wall. Other rituals included running between the hills of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa, drinking from the Zamzam well, standing vigil at Mount Arafat, and the symbolic stoning of the devil. While the meaning of Hajj centered on communal worship at the Grand Mosque and the final animal sacrifice in the nearby village of Mina, marketplaces thrived, even if officially discouraged. Ibn Jubair noted, between the hilltops of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa, a market full of fruits set up, such that pious runners could hardly free themselves from the great crowd. He described the exhalation after the 2 weeks when the Grand Mosque, the sanctuary of the Kaaba, became a great market in which were sold commodities ranging from flour to agates and from wheat to pearls. Poor Yemenis bartered wheat, raisins, or butter for women's veils or strong quilts worn by Bedouins. Rumi once told his students that the true place of the Kaaba in Islam was to fulfill the recorded saying of Muhammad that cohesion is a mercy and isolation torment. Visiting the Kaaba was made obligatory so that people from many cities and climes of the world might gather there. Yet most often he transposed Makkah to the spiritual plane, never commenting on his personal experience of Hajj. He even pitied a poor pilgrim lost in the surrounding desert. "O you who've gone on Hajj, where, oh where are you? Here is the beloved. Oh come now, come, oh come. You lost in the desert, what air of love is this? You are the house, the master, you are the Kaaba, you." Such sentiments reflected the attitudes he shared with, and may even have learned from, Atar and the Sufis of Baghdad in his Lives of the Saints. Atar told a story of Rabia on her way to Mecca being met and welcomed on the road by the Kaaba, rather than proceeding as a pilgrim to pay her respects at the shrine. "I need the lord of the house," she said. "What am I to do with the house?" Within a week of the conclusion of these sacred ceremonies, all pilgrim caravans once again departed for Yemen, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and points beyond, as Mecca and Medina reverted to quiet and sleepy towns until the following year. And the black stone of the Kaaba, for Rumi in his later poetry, like the Qibla, resolved into a human face. The pilgrim kisses the black stone of the Kaaba as if he were kissing the red lips of the beloved. Chapter 4. Fire fell into the world. As a gathering place for pilgrims from throughout the wider Muslim world, Makkah also served as a center of news and information, where Rumi and his family would have heard the latest in eyewitness reports or twice told rumors from various corners of the map. In 1217, the urgent talk among travelers from Central Asia concerned the threat of the Mongols. Since the time of the departure of Rumi's family from Khorasan, tensions had only increased between Genghis Khan and Khwarazm Shah, with word spreading of an onslaught that was taking place along the easternmost borders, nearer to Waksh and other outlying regions. The fate of those on Hajj was unclear, and the decisions open of whether to return to endangered cities such as Balkh or Samarkand. After Makkah, Rumi's family next appeared in Damascus, which required taking a route from Makkah back to Baghdad and connecting near its Syria gate with the Western Road, the entire journey lasting about 2 months. Not knowing whether war was imminent, Baha'u'llah would have been pushed to clarify his decisions about the future. A teaching post in Damascus, one of the core cities for Islamic intellectual life, along with Cairo and Baghdad, was desirable, but Baha'u'llah's imperfect spoken Arabic may have been an impediment, as seamless eloquence was expected from public speakers. Damascus itself was also volatile. While the Crusades, launched by the Latin Catholic Church, were, according to one historian, a sideshow compared to the destruction about to be inflicted by Tatar armies, Syria was still checkered by this conflict. The ruler of Damascus at the time was Al-Mu'azzam, whose father was off fighting the Fifth Crusade. Baha'u'llah moved with his family once again, this time from Syria to Anatolia, the Asian or Asia Minor section of modern-day Turkey, probably during the summer of 1217. Until this move, Rumi, about 10 or 11 years old, had been exposed to diverse religious groups, but always in Muslim-controlled areas and with clear Muslim majorities. Anatolia was territory defined in the imagination of Muslims as the outer limits of their civilization, the borderlands of Christian Rome or Rum. The term Rumi was used sometimes as a synonym for Christian, this shadow meaning still clinging to the name when used for Rumi after his death. From now on, they would be living in cities where they were greatly outnumbered by mostly Greek-speaking or Armenian Christians, with Muslims in Anatolia estimated at just 10% of the population. The city where they first alighted, Malatya, in southeast Anatolia, near a juncture of the Euphrates River, was a garrison town attached to an 8th century fortress, the first square of defense in a line of fortresses against the Byzantines, extending to the Mediterranean. Yakut described the town as part of Greek territories when he travelled through, yet the Seljuk Turks were apparently in charge when the family of Baha'u'llah resided there briefly. The climate of the large town wavered between desert aridity and northerly precipitation, as did its religious persuasions between Christian and Muslim. While in Malatya, the boy Rumi had the second of his repeated meetings with remarkable men. Also living in town at the time was the Spanish-born Arab mystic Ibn Arabi, the grandest and most sublime thinker of the era. His speculations concerning the merging of creator and creation, sometimes accused of being a pantheistic, heretical bending of the theology of a transcendent deity in Islam. Picking up pieces left behind in the writings of Al-Ghazali a century earlier, Ibn Arabi created a synthesis of mystical thinking, an intellectual Sufism in hundreds of volumes, where he developed ruminations on abstruse matters such as a science of letters of God's name, which had absorbed Sufi thinkers since at least the 11th century. Although he taught in Damascus, Syria was enough of a war zone that he passed the years from 1216 to 1220 in Malatya. As the story was told, a conversation had been arranged between the newly arrived Baha'u'llah and the greatest living master of Sufi theology. He brought along his son, yet when they departed, as with other, it was the boy who drew the attention of the great mystic. Watching young Rumi trail his father down the street, Ibn Arabi remarked, "Glory be to God, an ocean is following a lake." Again, Rumi never spoke of such a meeting. Yet unlike his supposed encounter with Atar, Rumi as an adult had more ambivalent feelings about Ibn Arabi, as about all things highly intellectual or abstruse, and later in life even made a small joke at Ibn Arabi's expense. He had walked into a hall where his disciples were discussing Ibn Arabi's esoteric Meccan revelations. Suddenly, Zaki the singer entered and broke into a joyful song. Rumi exclaimed, "Well, now the Zaki revelations are even finer than the Meccan revelations." And he began to whirl. His point was that music, poetry, and dance were more important than abstract ideas. The first solid patron of Baha'u'llah in Anatolia was Baharam Shah, the prince of Erzincan, and his wife, the Princess Esmati. Their capital was located at the upper end of the Euphrates Valley, where Rumi's family soon undertook yet another journey of 200 miles to northeast Anatolia. Erzincan was a large and primarily Armenian Christian town. Such towns often provoked the ire of visiting Muslims, who expressed indignation at all the wine, pork, and religious processions. Wishing to avoid these alien practices, Baha'u'llah insisted that his own school be established nearby in the more sober town of Akshar, and there he apparently was set up in the winter of 1218 in Esmetiye, named after his royal patroness, teaching general classes rather than a strict Hanfi law curriculum with a soft edge of Sufi mysticism. The minor Shah Farzin Khan was already accustomed to patronizing Persian cultural figures such as Baha'u'llah. He had earlier supported the production of a long didactic poem, Treasury of Secrets, written in the style of Sanai by Nizami. A court poet of Azerbaijan, Nizami had also written the most famous romance in Masnavi couplets, Lele and Majnu, a classic tale of the unrequited love of Majnu, a Bedouin youth, his name meaning crazy, driven insane by his intense devotion for the delicate Lele. This star-crossed pair remained in Rumi's imagination as his favorite fictional lovers, and he later sainted suffering Majnu as the quintessential Sufi martyr of love for God. Majnu embraced the Lele of night. Night is the time for divine solitude. Lele is night, and the day is ahead, Majnu. At dawn, wisdom will light the curls of her hair. About a year had passed since Rumi and his family had been on Hajj in Mecca. During this time, Baha'u'llah and anyone else from Khorasan was anxiously looking and listening to discover recent news of the situation there. No one was truly settled anywhere, yet the reports brought by travelers were increasingly dire, and any future plans of Baha'u'llah eventually to return were quickly demolished, their sojourn in Anatolia looking more permanent. If Rumi's family set out on their quest as pilgrims, or even as emigrants, within the next few years they wound up as displaced refugees. Rumi later brought to life the feelings aroused by hearing of the chaos caused by this greatest of historical disruptions. Day and night I'm thinking of you. In these bloody days and nights, how do you feel? As this fire fell into the world, in the smoke of the Tatar army, how do you feel? By the time Baha'u'llah was finally settled in his new school in Akhshar, the Khorasan region, where he had left behind his aged mother, as well as oldest son and daughter, was registering serious activity, sparked by a smaller border incident. Rumi later told this history with accuracy as he knew the terrain and players intimately. As a boy, he had seen the Asiatic faces of the traders in Chinese silk and camel cloth, silver and jade, and his father had early identified the unreliable character of the Khwarazm Shah. Some of them who used to come as traders into the territories of the Khwarazm Shah would buy muslin to clothe themselves. The Khwarazm Shah prohibited them and ordered the traders killed. He also taxed them and barred his own merchants from traveling to their lands. The Tatars went humbly before their king, wailing, "We have been destroyed." The king sought 10 days to consider the matter and went into a deep cave, where he fasted the 10 days, and he beseeched and prayed. A cry came from God, saying, "I have heard your plea. Come forth and be victorious wherever you go." They came out, and under God's command they were victorious and conquered the world. This provocation, retold by Rumi, occurred in 1217, when Genghis Khan, eyeing Khwarazm as a lucrative trading partner, sent his ambassadors to negotiate a trade agreement and followed them with a caravan of 450 merchants carrying luxury goods. As the caravan crossed into present-day Kazakhstan, just north of Rumi's childhood home, its governor, a relative of the Khwarazm Shah, seized the goods and killed the merchants as spies. Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand retribution. Instead, Khwarazm Shah beheaded one envoy and returned the others, their beards insultingly shaved. Verifying Rumi's account, the contemporary Persian historian Giovanni reported that Genghis Khan ascended a mountaintop to pray and descended, ready for war. He dramatically added that the rash acts would wind up having laid waste a whole world. The ensuing punishing invasion lasted 4 years until Genghis Khan, in his 60s, returned home to Mongolia, leaving behind in ruins the grand cities that Rumi had known as a boy: Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, Herat, Merv, and Nishapur. As Giovanni described the vanguard of the descent of the Mongol forces on Bukhara, a signature display of sound and fury, the townspeople beheld the surrounding countryside choked with horsemen and the air black as night with the dust of cavalry, and fright and panic overcame them. Genghis Khan himself rode into the town that for Rumi stands for the true source of knowledge, halting to ask if the mosque, the biggest edifice, were the Sultan's palace. He ordered imams to feed his horses using the libraries as stables and Quran stands as mangers for straw. One survivor succinctly reported, "They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed." From Bukhara, the Mongol armies proceeded through the fertile Zarafshan Valley to attack Samarkand, an operation far more brutal than the siege Rumi had witnessed as a boy, just 8 years earlier. Mongol numbers were augmented by a forced march of prisoners, the weakest dropping from exhaustion. Outside the walls of the city, these prisoners were disguised as soldiers, with every 10th one holding a flag, so that the citizens of Samarkand imagined a force many times larger. Genghis Khan entered by the northwest gate, dividing 30,000 of the skilled artisans among his sons and kinsmen, and then killing a sizable portion of the population. The lustrous new cathedral mosque built by Khwarazm Shah after his own siege was bombarded with hurled pots of flaming tar. The cavalry then retraced the same route from Samarkand to Balkh that had likely been traveled by Rumi's family. Their maze, where Rumi's tutor Borhan stayed behind, was shown no mercy. Giovanni recorded that all the people, both men and women, were driven out onto the plain and divided proportionately among the soldiers in accordance with their usual custom. Then they were all slain, none being spared. In Balkh, where members of Baha'u'llah's family were perhaps still living, any fortifications and walls, as well as mansions and palaces, were obliterated, and the killing fields of Termez were replicated. Wild beasts feasted on their flesh, and lions consorted without contention with wolves, and vultures ate without quarrelling from the same table with eagles. Nishapur suffered the most numbing treatment of all the cities in this prolonged exercise in bloody revenge and tactical empire building. An arrow shot from the city ramparts during its defense killed the Kuchar, the son-in-law of Genghis Khan. The conqueror allowed his widowed and pregnant daughter to exact the revenge. In April 1221, she decreed death for all except 400 craftsmen, including dogs, cats, and any living animals, and ordered the skulls of the corpses to be piled into 3 pyramids for men, women, and children. A few accounts numbered Atar among these dead, seemingly fitting for this subtle and melancholy poet who described himself as the voice of pain. For the 3 years leading up the Mongol invasion, the geographer Yakut had been staying happily in Merv, where he was researching his travel books in its many libraries. But for the Mongols, I would have stayed there and lived and died there, he wrote, and hardly could I tear myself away. When the Mongol attack was imminent, Yakut fled to Mosul. Soon afterward, the invaders burned down all of its libraries and smashed the dams and dikes, so that the oasis reverted to a desert swamp. Yakut then joined an exodus of displaced Persians on the clogged roads heading west toward Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. Caravans now included escapees from Khorasan crossing paths with returning Hajj pilgrims. In Baghdad, lodging was in short supply and housing difficult to rent as the displaced attempted to find places to stay. In a letter penned shortly after his escape, Yakut, in an effusive, elegiac court style, mourned the palaces he had witnessed effaced from off the earth as lines of writing are effaced from paper, and those abodes become a dwelling for the owl and the raven. In those places the screech owls answer each other's cries, and in those halls the winds moan. The number of dead were wildly exaggerated at the time, with suggestions of casualties in the hundreds of millions, far beyond the population of any cities in Central Asia. Even some modern scholars, though, have confirmed the possibility of a 90% extermination rate among the Persian population in Khorasan, constituting racial genocide. If a percentage of the victims were spared for deportation as skilled slaves, Genghis Khan was uncompromising in his systematic destruction of cities, as well as lead piping and irrigation systems, turning farms and orchards back to grazing lands for his herds. Voicing a general pessimism in the society, one contemporary historian opined that the Mongols were the announcement of the death blow of Islam and the Muslims. Yet, as Genghis Khan was establishing his brutist militarist state in Central Asia, an absolute threat to the religion of Islam, curiously resilient were the mystical practices of Sufism, already established in the western provinces and revivified by these Khorasani immigrants, including Baha'u'llah and his family. Sufi lodges became welcome cultural outposts of refinement, where sheikhs or spiritual leaders offered messages of hope and transcendence, friendship and love, as well as musical concerts, poetry, and dance evoking rapture. Sufi orders, loosely similar to Western religious orders, were beginning to multiply and would become more formalized in the next decades and centuries. As the German Middle East scholar Annemarie Schimmel summed up the contrast, this period of the most terrible political disaster was, at the same time, a period of highest religious and mystical activity. The full force of the Mongol campaigns would be concentrated in 2 aggressive phases. The first, the conquest of Central Asia, and the second, commandeered by the grandsons of Genghis Khan, marked by incursions into the Middle East and Anatolia in the 1250s. A newly configured world map spread contiguous Mongol-controlled territories from Korea to Hungary. From the age of 10 until his death, Rumi coped with the turmoil caused by this churning realpolitik of the Mongols. Yet either ignoring or because of the pain and suffering caused to his family and community as an adult, Rumi stuck resolutely to his surety of an invisible hand in these dark historical events. While everyone flees from the Tatars, we serve the creator of the Tatars. He framed the issue even more starkly for his circle, often immigrants from Khorasan, writing, "If you're afraid of the Tatars, you don't believe in God." In the final phase of his life, Baha'u'llah, now nearly 70 years old, found the acceptance, even acclaim which had eluded him during his earlier years. He might well have discerned divine providence at work and communicated to his son this understanding of otherwise tragic events. His choice of location in Asia Minor was not random, as he moved as an itinerant preacher from city to city and patron to patron, working his way always closer to Konya, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, ruled by Sultan Al-Din Kekubad I, which he may have first visited as early as 1221. And of course, the timing of his late life migration had allowed his family to escape possible execution by the world conqueror known by then simply as the Accursed. He and his family spent the next 7 years in the center of Anatolia before finally arriving in Konya, and Rumi passed from a boyhood spent traveling to young manhood. Within 4 years of arriving in Erzincan, by 1222, Baha'u'llah was finally on his way with his family to the more central city of Larand, well inside the realm of the Seljuk Sultanate. The daughter of the Shah of Erzincan had been married to Kekos I, the Seljuk king, and may have smoothed the way for Baha'u'llah with members of the royal family. Originally one of the dozens of nomadic Turkic clans in Central Asia, the Seljuks were nearly the apogee of a 2-century hold on power in the Central Islamic lands. In 1055, the great Seljuks had taken control as protector of the Abbasid Caliphate. In 1077, the Seljuks in Anatolia defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert near Erzincan, almost to their own surprise, giving them sway over much of Asia Minor. Arriving when he was about 15 years old, Rumi truly came of age in Larand, or modern-day Karaman, 60 miles southeast of Konya. The hilltop town was full of gardens, fountains, and sweet beaches, which he later said could set a whole town smiling. Today 100 beautiful faces are smiling in Konya. Today 100 pages are arriving from Larand. This pleasant association fit the experience of his family, particularly his father. Baha'u'llah's patron was the local governor, who built him an entire school on the main square in town. Baha's orientation as a Sunni Hanafite with Sufi leanings fit with the broader agenda of the Seljuks, as they had been part of the military force behind a Sunni revival of the Abbasid Caliphate and had originally been converted to Islam by the heartwarming preaching of the Sufis. This formula worked especially well in trying to win over the local Greek Christians rather than a hardline legalism. Larand also included many Christian Turks who were writing Turkish using a Greek alphabet. Most of Rumi's adolescent education took place in these learned settings arranged for his father in such Anatolian towns. In spite of any juvenile resistance to primary school lessons, he had grown into an avid pupil, curious and studying widely, absorbing all manner of religious, scientific, and literary texts. The basics of his classwork were meant to prepare him for a life of preaching, teaching, and judging. He studied Arabic grammar and prosody, commentaries on the Quran, accounts of the life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Sharia, or religious law. He also studied history, philosophy, mathematics, and a favorite Persian science, astronomy, its scientific instruments for precise measuring and stargazing recurring in many of his later lyrics. The sky is an astrolabe, while the truth is love. When I speak, spin your ear towards my meaning. Turning 17 in Larand, Rumi was wed in 1224 to Kohar in a ceremony that bore all the marks of a traditionally arranged marriage. As the daughter of Sharaf of Samarkand, the deceased patron and disciple of Baha'u'llah, and his widow, the matriarch now known as the Great Gara, Kohar had been close to Rumi since they were both learning their alphabet. She had travelled with her mother in the harem of the caravan all the way from Samarkand, and like Rumi had grown from a child into a young adult over the course of the eventful decade. Rare memories which they shared. Almost immediately they had 2 sons, Bahauddin Muhammad, later known as Sultan Walid, born in 1226 and named with his grandfather's full name, and Alauddin Muhammad, named for Rumi's older brother, who possibly died during the long journey. Rumi was keenly observant of the process of giving birth and the transformation of a wife into a mother, his empathy palpable in the Masnavi, where he writes of pregnant women trembling at each spasm or chewing on clay lumps to help ease their birth pangs. In childbirth, every mother suffers aches. As her baby tries to break out of prison, the mother cries, "Where is my refuge?" The baby laughs, "Salvation is here." He graphically rendered the first demanding phases of child-rearing when he devised an analogy for his students about God's transformative patience with spiritual immaturity. God is able to do all things. When a child is newly born, he is worse than a donkey. He puts his hand in his filth and then his hand in his mouth to lick. His mother slaps him to prevent it. When he pisses, he spreads his legs so that the pee doesn't drip on his leg. Yet God is able to turn a baby into a human being. And he tenderly recalled a mother's breastfeeding moments at the side of a baby's crib. Unless the baby in the cradle cries and weeps, how does the anxious mother know how to feed him milk? From earliest childhood, Rumi's two sons were a tumble of conflicts. Even the order of their births has never firmly been established. Sultan Walid was named after his grandfather, a distinction signaling a firstborn, especially as Rumi's father was about 75 years old at his birth. Yet one contemporary biographer recorded that Alauddin was 1 year older. Less ambiguous would be Sultan Walid's place as his father's favorite, not only his child, but also his disciple. Revering his father as Rumi had revered and tried to emulate Baha'u'llah. So sibling rivalry was ever roiling between these brothers, a source of pain for their father, who sketched all boys' games as combative. Wars are like the fights of children, meaningless, thoughtless, and petty. They aim at each other with wooden swords, but their goals and purpose are futile. In Larand, Rumi, now a married young adult, stepped into the position of preacher, occasionally taking his father's place on the steps of the pulpit, where sermons were delivered in mosques, or in the seat of honor in a college. In the medieval Muslim world, preaching was an art and a pillar of moral teaching, both entertainment and instruction. Rumi's father's delivery was fiery, a popular timber. His grandson Sultan Walid told of him once throttling 3 sturdy camel drivers on the road to Baghdad. They repented and begged forgiveness, he said, comparing his grandfather to a lion. Such force came through in his sermons. He was saturated in the preaching culture of Khorasan, where sermons often ended on shrill warnings about judgment on the last day, as weeping listeners, revival style, came forward to repent of sins by having their heads shaved. Rumi's tone was already more dulcet and controlled. He did not preach fire and brimstone, yet he adhered to the basic model. His early sermons were traditional and fairly standard, opening with a benediction in Arabic rhymed prose, in the style of the Quran, praising God, His Messenger Muhammad, and Abu Bakr, the first of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, venerated by Sunni Muslims. He then prayed for God's intercession in a lyrical Persian that was full of crescendos. The language was understood in Anatolia by the many Persian immigrants, as well as being generally used as the universal court language for business and ceremonies. In one sermon, evidently delivered in Larand, he prayed for his father and mother and for his instructor, another figure clearly involved in his sophisticated religious education. He then repeated in Arabic a saying of the Prophet, the text of his sermon, after which he switched back into Persian. In periodic flashes, the later mystic and poet Rumi can be glimpsed in some of these early sermons. Otherwise, they were the works of a young man trying to conform to his father's pattern. In one of 7 surviving sermons, he borrows a metaphor from a long poem attributed to Attar, the Book of the Camel. But common enough in mystical literature, a Turkish puppeteer performs with 7 whales, and at the end of the night, like the cosmic creator, breaks all of his puppets and stores their pieces again in the dark box of unity. In his opening prayer, Rumi makes enchanting theology from this material. The magician of the skies, from behind the curtain of imagination, brings forth the play of shimmering stars and gorgeous planets. We crowd around this theatrical spectacle, mesmerized, passing away the night. In the morning, death will arrive, and the performance of these shadow players will grow cold, and the night of our life will vanish. O Lord, before the morning of death dawns, Let our hearts grow cold toward this play, so that we might escape in time from this crowd, and not fall behind those who have been travelling through the night. When morning dawns, may we find ourselves arriving within the wider precinct of your acceptance. Around 1229, Baha'u'llah finally received his invitation from the Sultan Alauddin Kayqubad I to travel to Konya to teach and to live with his family at the Al-Tunba Madrasa, the only madrasa operating at the time in the capital. If Baha'u'llah hoped to realize his wish to be preaching in one of the more glorious cities, he was fortunate. The Sultan was gathering together a court unequaled in the Anatolian Seljuk dynasty, with many Persian-speaking poets, artisans, administrators, and scholars, even if the atmosphere included wine drinking and harp playing, which Baha'u'llah abhorred. Others were not so fortunate. Uprooted scholars, poets, and religious leaders, bereft of their former university posts or courtly sinecures, were arriving in Anatolia daily, and the court of Kayqubad I was murmured among them to be the most supportive refuge as they tried to recode their livelihoods in the aftermath of extreme trauma. Just one example of a suddenly needy fellow scholar was Najmuddin Razi, a leading Sufi thinker, a generation younger than Baha'u'llah, who fled the Mongols to Kayseri in East Anatolia and quickly dispatched inscribed copies of his well-known writings to the Seljuk Sultan without the desired result of a royal invitation to Konya. Yet Baha'u'llah had luckily managed to salvage, even improve life for himself and his uprooted family. Before the Walad family departed for Konya, Rumi's mother died and was buried in Larand. The burial place of Momin, known as Mother Sultan by the Mevlevis, became a much-visited shrine. By the time Rumi, now a young father and preacher, left Larand, he had experienced not only a panoply of travelling, but he had also seen the stages of life played out. With the deaths of his mother and older brother, his marriage to a childhood friend, and the births of their 2 sons, who took their names from the older generations. Rumi would discover in birth and the constant metamorphosis of the life cycle his favorite metaphor for the inner life. Like a baby in the womb, I am nourished with blood. Everyone is born once. I have been born many times. Chapter 5. Konya. Thick stone walls, 140 watchtowers, and 12 gates rose from the central plateau of Anatolia, with all the force and stature of the ramparts of Samarkand, Bukhara, Balkh, or Nishapur, as Rumi's family made their way to settle in the city where he would spend most of his adult life. The difference between Konya and these classic cities, by then mostly razed to the ground, was its relative newness. In 1229, Konya was still a buzzing construction project rather than a monument to the past, the Seljuk capital intended as a living replication of these former capitals of Khorasan. The Sultan Alauddin Kayqubad I had attempted to consolidate and add legitimacy to his raw power by creating a Turco-Persian axis and co-opting Persian literature, religion, art, and architecture, as well as statecraft and pageantry. Baha'u'llah and his family would have felt some sense of familiarity and even homecoming as they relocated to the capital, a kinship that resonated in warm tones in Rumi's later poetry. Come into my house, beloved, a short while. Freshen my soul, beloved, a short while, so that the light of love radiates from Konya to Samarkand and Bukhara a short while. Even in its layout, Konya more closely resembled the cities of Central Asia than those of Asia Minor. Houses were spread out between markets and flower gardens. Streets and wide alleys were lined with terracotta gullies of running water. Fountains were inset into the walls of public buildings and arch-shaped enclosures. Public baths were centrally located, with sections for men and women, and fresh water spilling continuously from a spout into a basin. All the water was drawn from a reservoir pool beneath a marble dome at one of the city gates. The 3 miles of city walls were arranged as a rectangle with rounded corners, while the Citadel Hill was freestanding in the center of town in a pentagonal shape, with its own wall and towers constituting a second inner ring of protection. None of this conventional scheme or its social significance was lost on Rumi, who later delineated its rigid hierarchy for his son from a celestial perspective. Bahauddin, in the city of Konya, notice how many thousands of houses, villas, and mansions belong to commanders, noblemen, and the wealthy. And notice how the houses of the gentlemen and administrators are grander than the houses of the artisans, and the mansions of the commanders are grander than the houses of the gentlemen. Likewise, the arches and palaces of the sultans and rulers are 100 times grander and more splendid than the others. But the height and splendor of the heavens, compared with these mansions, turns out to be far more lofty, mighty, and splendid, and indeed many times more so. Having drawn on Persian mythology to enhance his status in the capital, Sultan Alauddin Kekobad I lent himself an invented pedigree distinct from his nomadic Turkic ancestors, beginning with his name. Like his brother Kekos I and his father Kekosro I, the Sultan took his royal name from the great fictional kings of the seminal epic of Rumi's boyhood in Khorasan, the Shahnam or the Book of Kings. The Sultan likewise had chiseled onto the towers of the two main entrances to Konya's citadel sculptural figures and quotations in tall gold lettering from the Shahnam, and throughout the palaces were set statues of dragons, a symbol in the epic poem of a Turk warrior whom Ferdowsi in the Shahnam describes as a dangerous dragon whose breath is as fire. The Sultan's glorification of all things Persian, combined with the status of the Seljuks as latecomers to Islam, helped create the perfect milieu for welcoming Rumi's family to Konya, as well as the later crucial tolerance and protection for Rumi by the Sultan's descendants. Kekobad I was the single most important force in the reversal of fortune for Rumi's family, and was generally convincing in fulfilling the heroic ideal of his glorious fictional namesake. His reign was the bright center of the comparatively brief 2-century arc of Imperial Seljuk Rum. Having ascended to power in 1219, after surviving imprisonment by his older brother Kekos I, he was a mostly wise ruler, evidently charismatic, though considered overly haughty by some of his emirs. He was also an able administrator, bringing into his treasury annual revenue of 3,300,000 gold dinars from trade with Europe, and according to one historian, embellishing Konya beyond all recognition. During his 15-year reign, his armies secured the whole of Asia Minor from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, transforming Anatolia into a maritime power. When Konya was the classical Roman city of Iconium, Paul from coastal Tarsus preached Christianity on this acropolis. Built by a Syrian architect, the mosque retained the floor plan of the Great Mosque of Damascus with a flat roof. The main prayer room held 4,000 worshippers with an atmosphere of awe created by 42 marble columns like a stone forest. Including an intricate ebony pulpit, the congregational mosque was used for noon sermons, and Rumi would kneel many Fridays on its woolen prayer rugs. I prayed so much that I turned into prayer. Whoever looks into my face remembers to pray. The imaginative creatures chiseled on walls and gates surrounding these ceremonial buildings, including the palace, which stretched from the main gate to the wall of the mosque, would filter into Rumi's imagination too. 2 pairs of winged angels guarded entrances to the citadel. Over 20 lions and several double-headed eagles were carved in relief, as well as a caparisoned elephant pierced by a rhinoceros's horn. If you turn into a lion, love turns into a lion hunter. If you turn into an elephant, love turns into a rhinoceros. Built as well at the command of Kekobad I in 1229, the probable year of the arrival of Rumi's family in Konya, was Sultan Han, a traveller's caravanserai on the road from Kayseri to Konya, in a region of flat Anatolian grasslands, broken only by clumps of mountains, much like the steppes of Central Asia. In the first decades of the 13th century, the main Seljuk construction project was to repair the old Roman stone roads, making them safer for merchants, and positioning rest houses at distances of 9 hours' travel by camel, or every 18 miles. The largest of these inns provided mosques and fountains, camel and horse stables, kitchens and bathhouses. The Sultan Han even kept a band of musicians for entertainment. Near the outside gates, water usually gushed from stone animal fountains, decorative yet for Rumi, also symbolic. On all the roads they have built caravanserais with stone birds and other figures set around the edges of pools. Water flows from their mouths and spills into pools. Any intelligent person knows that the water is not flowing from the beaks of the stone birds, but from some other place. His analogy was to God's force behind whatever words, voices, or languages he wills. These government-funded inns and reinforced roadways were crucial in Anatolia during the severe winters when heavy snowdrifts inundated the highlands, 5,000 feet above sea level, forcing travelers to remain indoors for days until the roads were cleared. At night, Easterners and Westerners and Transoceanians stay together inside the same caravanserai. Small and great remain together for days at the inn because of the frost and the snow. As soon as the road is opened and the obstacles removed, they separate and go in their different directions. Prime time for traveling was spring, the season the family of Baha'u'llah would have chosen in the absence of any pressing issues, when the roads leading into Konya from the Salt Lake to the north were lined with camels bearing salt, as well as grass, straw, or wood. On other passes into town, fields of cotton and corn gave way to gardens of yellow plums, or the famous Konya Qamar al-Din, or moon of faith apricots. On mornings following thunderstorms, more roses opened, more greenery filled in, and the scent of silverberry trees hanging like willows with yellow blossoms pervaded. Spring is the favorite season in Rumi's poems, his springtime vignettes often vividly Anatolian. The rose garden and sweet basil, all shades of peonies, a violet bed among the dirt, and wind and water and fire, O heart. Baha'u'llah was reportedly given a royal welcome to Konya. His great-grandson, Rumi's grandson, Arif Chalebi, about 90 years later, commissioned a disciple of Laki to gather memories of these times from survivors and collect them in an often romanticized history titled The Acts of the Mystics. According to Aflaki, the Sultan Alauddin Kekabad I personally greeted Baha'u'llah and offered him residence, if he preferred, in a room in the palace used for storing vessels or hand-washing, as well as for sleeping quarters. In declining health, Baha'u'llah, now an old man of Khorasan, spoke of the traditional divisions of society, perhaps not quite as set in the still evolving Seljuk room. Religious teachers belong in schools, he said, Sufis in lodges, commanders and princes in palaces, merchants in inns, artisans in guilds, and foreigners in guest houses. The extravagant gestures credited to the Sultan were extraordinary for a king, such as kissing the knee of Baha'u'llah, but not entirely out of character. Sultan Kekabad I was always at pains to display his reverence, especially towards mystical teachers, from the spiritual homeland of Khorasan, considered a repository of ancient Persian wisdom, as well as known territory to the Turkic clan. As Asia Minor was set off from the Arabian mainland and its population was mostly Greek and Armenian Christian, Islam was being allowed to develop under these Seljuks in a fashion more attuned to the universalism of Ibn Arabi. While living in Malada, Ibn Arabi had served as an advisor and a spiritual father for the Sultan's older brother, Kekos I. The Seljuk Sultans also believed that prayers for prosperity from saintly old men such as Baha'u'llah were especially potent. Fitting Baha'u'llah's sense of propriety, as in Baghdad, he and his family then set up residence at a school rather than in a Sufi lodge or palace room. The Al-Tunba Madrasa and Mosque had been built for the Sultan's commander, Shamsuddin al-Tunbi, in 1202 in the sober and restrained style of early Seljuk architecture, and was located near the main market square in the more populous district of Konya. Such Seljuk schools tended to be rectangular two-story buildings with lecture halls and study rooms on the first floor, and student bedrooms with fireplaces and cupboards on the second floor, set around a central courtyard and fountain, much like a medieval cloister. Baha'u'llah paid retainers of 1,000 dinars each to two of his new disciples, a baker and a butcher, described as pleasant and polite young men, to tend to the kitchen and to the meals. Baha'u'llah rapidly attracted a number of other disciples, both men and women. Rather than a drawback, his advanced age of nearly 80 was considered desirable in a religious teacher. In a manual for students written a few decades earlier in Khorasan, One Hanfi jurist advised selecting as a teacher the most learned, the most pious, and the most advanced in years. With his livelihood secured by the Sultan, Baha'u'llah, as an Akshar and Larand, began teaching a mixture of law, ethics, and mystical Islam, and drawing students from different social classes. He shared his learning not only with the weaver and with someone identifying himself as a simple-hearted Turk, but also with the courtiers. An early disciple of Baha'u'llah from among the governing elite was Emir Badruddin Gohardash, also known as the fortress commander, one of the chief stewards of the palace. Gohardash took responsibility for building a new madrasa for Baha'u'llah and his family that eventually came to be known during Rumi's lifetime as the Madrasa Khudavankar, and to establish the village of Kara Arslan as its endowment, a financial practice designating a portion of the village income from farming to the madrasa. While closer to the ceremonial main gate of entrance to the citadel and the palace, this madrasa was located in the same general neighborhood as the Madrasa al-Tunba, a merchant and artisan district of earthen houses with red tile roofs set among cypresses, maples, and thick oak trees, the sound of water flowing in its gutters always faintly audible. The madrasa included an adjoining harem for Rumi's wife and mother-in-law, as well as his 2 young boys, who remained, as he had, living in the harem until age 10 or 11. Baha'u'llah's decision to live near the markets made his teaching available to a wider following, as the citadel was a much more elite and self-contained gated town within a town. Only about 900 of the 100,000 residents of Konya lived and worked in the defended citadel. They were mostly administrators, palace servants, translators, often Jewish doctors, and as Rumi observed, commanders living in houses just to the north that were visible from the 2-story, blue-tiled imperial palace, its balconies facing in 3 directions atop an outer wall. The entire complex included a harem, bakery, treasury, bathhouse, stables, wine cellar, gardens, and, about 50 yards from the great mosque, the church of Saint Amphilochius, a chapel used by the many Christian mothers, wives, and daughter-in-law of the sultans. One of the wives of Kekabad I, Mahbari, was a Greek Christian. She was the mother of his eldest son and successor, Khosrow II. This nearly accidental religious diversity, a matter of indifference as much as design among these governing sultans, eventually helped to create the conditions for Rumis being able to inspire, teach, and learn lessons from all of these different faith communities at once. Baha'u'llah did preach regularly at the great mosque in the citadel complex. Indeed, Gohardash first approached him at the mosque of the Sultan, following a sermon that he found powerful. Yet Baha'u'llah mostly moved among the merchants and craftsmen, following a routine similar to his life in Baksh. In the style of the Sufis, he liked to wander about the Konya cemetery, reciting the Quran in a low voice. One day he had a pulpit set up outside the cemetery and preached to both men and women about the day of resurrection, reminding them of the stark terrors of the final judgment. He continued delivering legal judgments, many as strict as ever, especially on drinking wine, with his son Rumi always beside him, increasingly serving as his tongue and walking stick. After 2 years, Baha'u'llah's health began to fail. Most of his teeth were now missing, his voice quavering, and he was receiving his followers, including the Sultan, at home. "Wait until I pass away and you see how my son Jalaluddin Muhammad turns out," he said of his son, then 23 years old. "He will take my place and become more elevated than I." Late one morning, in February 1231, at about 80 years of age, Baha'u'llah died. Having led his family thousands of miles, escaping possible extinction, and achieving recognition for wise leadership, he died as a patriarch and hero for his community. Kekubad I donated the grounds in his rose gardens beyond the Horse Bazaar gate where Baha'u'llah was buried. When his grandson Sultan Walad later wrote of the widely attended funeral, he emphasized the passing of authority next to his father. After the mourning was complete, all the people, young and old, gathered round and looked to his son, saying, "You are like him in beauty. From now on we will hold to the hem of your robe. We will follow you wherever you go. From now on, you are our king." Rumi had always been a highly sensitive and emotional boy. So he remained as a young and mature man, with no event so far in his life shaking and challenging him as much as the death of the father he idolized and emulated. He would return, full of both sorrow and need, to the grave of Baha'u'llah near a marble fountain whenever he wished to gather his thoughts or solve problems. Faced with crises, he was often spotted striding out through the horse bazaar gate to visit his father's tomb. He clearly heard the correct answer from the garden of his father's tomb, said one of the townspeople. Rumi also began carrying pages of his father's writing tucked into the inner sleeve pocket of his long robes. Although Baha'u'llah was outwardly strict and stressed the wages of sin, his private journal was filled with intimate meditations on divine love, expressed in passionate language, that allowed Rumi to hear the voice of his dear father once again, filling him with warmth and purpose and informing his ideas about love and God. The most effective and the strongest creation of God is love, wrote Baha'u'llah. Nothing created by God is as strong and as marvelous as love. Without love, life lacks its true power. I am constantly remembering God, and I am always occupied with Him. Following the death of his father, Rumi traveled to Lorand, where his mother was buried and many of his father's students from his former school were living. He obviously felt a need to reconnect with family and homeland. One day during this visit, the grieving son received a startling message. His mentor from Khorasan, Borhan, had not only survived the Mongol devastation in Termez, but had arrived in Konya and was staying in the Sanchari Mosque. Rumi had not seen his tutor in 15 years, since Borhan carried him on his shoulders during childhood, so he quickly returned home. Borhan, now over 60 years old, rushed through the front door of the mosque, and the two embraced again. The timing of Borhan's appearance, around 12:32, was uncanny. Borhan attributed his arrival to the prodding of Baha'u'llah in a dream. As Borhan was mourning the news of his passing, Baha'u'llah angrily rebuked him. Burhanuddin, why is it that you are not attending upon our Khudavandgar, but have left him alone? This is not the behavior of a guardian and a tutor. What explanation do you give for this shortcoming? According to a different report, Borhan was on pilgrimage in Mecca when he learned from either the sheikhs of Syria or the pilgrims of Rome of the whereabouts of Baha'u'llah, but not of his death. The result, either way, was fortunate for Rumi, who was not yet quite ready to assume leadership of the school, the age of wisdom in Islam being considered about 40. So he invited Borhan to move into his room and to take over his father's place as preacher and teacher. Borhan, in turn, invited Rumi to learn more of the secret knowledge he had received from Baha'u'llah. The psychological subtleties of the matter they needed to discuss could only be understood, he explained, in intimate encounters between a teacher and a student. On their reunion, Borhan told Rumi, "Your father mastered both knowledge of words and knowledge of spiritual states." Encouraging him to expand his knowledge of such states, Borhan became Rumi's sheikh or spiritual director. Over the next decade, he plotted the course of his spiritual higher education. Listening to Borhan was like listening to his father. He trusted him and regarded him with filial tenderness. At the madrasa, Borhan took flight with Sufi notions of the mystical life. He was less circumspect than Baha'u'llah, though he likewise rarely used the term Sufi, preferring to speak of mystics or of dervishes, the Turkish version of a Persian word for those who had renounced the world and served God in poverty. He loved poetry more than Baha'u'llah and recited favorite lines from the poems of Sanai and Athar. Yet his presence gave the followers of Baha'u'llah a sense of continuity, as he was an aging, dignified preacher, scholar, ascetic, and Quranic commentator. With his Khorasani accent and bearing, he carried with him echoes of the vanished worlds of Samarkand and Gooch. Borhan was always trying to impart esoteric ideas he described as secrets, which essentially conveyed an understanding of divinity as present in everyone. The science he was teaching was a science of the soul, but such a science was not easily put into language and presented perils of the lines between human and divine appeared to have been crossed. Most of the Sufis' doubling of language and use of elliptical and poetic words was intended to, or subtly resulted in, the intertwining of the divine and the human, either through transformation by knowledge, a vision of light, or ecstatic immolation in love. Burhan used many of the standard Sufi images for these experiences, such as discovering a pearl, reflecting light in a mirror, or burning like a moth in a flame. With students, perhaps even Rumi, taking notes, he explained, "You are your own pearl. If you don't know anything else, but know yourself, then you are a scholar and a mystic. If you don't know yourself, then all the science and knowledge that you possess is useless." Such messages of self-knowledge were not unfamiliar to the Greeks of Anatolia either. From the inscription "Know thyself," "Know Thesioton," or the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, knowledge, or gnosis, had been aligned for the classical Greeks with religion. Neoplatonic thought, emphasizing knowledge as a mystical path, was alive in the Anatolian region, and Plato was an almost magical figure, treated as a saint by both Greeks and Turks. Near Konya bubbled Aflon Pinari, or Plato Spring, where he was believed to have lived. Aflatun was a translation of Plato. Some said Plato was buried in the chapel on Citadel. Rumi often visited the monks in the Aflatun monastery near Konya, and he made Plato a symbol of great wisdom in his Masnavi. God's seal on the eyes and ears of the intelligence turns an intelligent man into an animal, even if he is a Plato. Sometimes he spoke of Plato in the tones he usually reserved for a Sufi spiritual master. Whatever the Plato of the age advises you to do, give up your self-will and act accordingly to his counsel. This resonance may have helped the warm reception given Khorasani mystics in town. Yet, not all his students immediately took to Burhan. Baha'u'llah had kept a judicial, scholarly tone, while Burhan was more openly, rather than covertly, mystical and poetical. Rumi often needed to come to his defense. Some of the infighting was stinging enough that Rumi could still relate the heated debates to his own students decades after Burhan's death, especially concerning the mixing of poetry with theology. They said, "Sayyid Burhanuddin speaks very well, but he quotes Sanai's poetry too often. This is like saying the sun is good, but it gives off too much light. Is that a fault?" Quoting Sanai's words casts more light on the discussion. Sunlight casts light on things. Once, a student interrupted Burhan to protest his overuse of analogies as a frivolous tool for scholars to use. As Rumi told the story, Burhan was not shy in defending his methods. Sayyid Burhanuddin was giving a lecture. A fool broke in and said, "We need words without analogies." Sayyid answered, "Let him who seeks to hear words without analogies draw closer. For you are actually an analogy yourself. You are not this thing. Yourself is only your shadow. When someone dies, people say that he has departed. If he were this thing, where has he gone? It is clear that your appearance is only an analogy of your true self, from which your true self can be deduced." Others adored Burhan in the manner a dervish did toward his sheikh, looking for guidance on a path deemed dangerous without direction from a mature teacher, a path envisioned by Burhan as an expansive journey, like the flight of others' birds. The path of reunion has no end, he told them. God is the goal and destination. His most excited recent follower on the spiritual quest was a humble, unlearned goldsmith, Salahuddin Zerkub, a Turk from one of the nearby fishing villages on the Konya plains, who arrived in the capital in the 1230s to set up a small shop in the goldsmith's bazaar. He was fervent about Burhan's emphasis on fasting and purification, and became important enough to Rumi later in life for him to describe Salah as his root of spiritual joy. Rumi spent a year or so in the growing circle of Burhan, learning more of the basics of Sufi thought. He was highly receptive to all of Burhan's mystical languages and concepts. Burhan imparted to Rumi his passion for Halaj, also known as Mansoor. He liked to make a contrast between the I of the villain Pharaoh in the Quran, proudly refusing to bend to God's will in the liberation of the Hebrew slaves, with the egoless I in the I am the truth of Halaj, which reportedly got him executed in Baghdad. Pharaoh, God's curse upon him, said, "I am your Lord," preached Burhan. His use of the word I brought God's curse upon him. Mansur said, I am the truth, and his use of the word I was a mercy from God. In his Masnavi years later, Rumi neatly set this thought of Burhan. I am the truth, shone from Mansur's lips like light. I am the Lord, fell from Pharaoh's lips like a threat. Burhan eventually decided on a plan to prepare Rumi to manage the school established by his father and evolve into a religious jurist and guider of souls. To accomplish this ambition, Burhan resolved that his young charge travel to the most respected colleges in Aleppo and Damascus and study with elevated scholars in a curriculum combining readings in law and religion for the glass bead game of esoteric knowledge. Burhan would take responsibility for caretaking the madrasa, and their grandmother, the great Kara, would serve as spiritual mother for Rumi's boys, then about 6 years old. She was considered another beneficiary of Baha'u'llah's higher secrets. From the seat of honor one day, Burhan singled out Rumi and addressed him directly, charging him with his eminent mission. God the Almighty elevate you to the rank of your father. No one is at a higher rank than him, or I would have prayed, God, let him surpass him, but that is the ultimate. Rumi's son painted the farewell as even more luminous, remembering Burhan as extravagantly and emotionally blessing Rumi at his departure with the glorious prediction, and like the sun, you'll scatter light worldwide. Chapter 6. I kept hearing my own name. Arriving in Aleppo in northern Syria to begin his studies at about the age of 25, and moving on eventually to Damascus, Rumi took his place in an entitled, turbaned class of scholars and their chosen students. This selective gathering of the religious elite was made all the more lively and competitive, as Syria in the early decades of the 13th century was widely considered the heart of Muslim culture in the Arabic language. Here he could see once again the learned society of debaters, with clipped beards, trailing turban tassels, and green academic robes with wide, long sleeves, which he first might have glimpsed as a boy in the courtyards of Nizamiya College in Baghdad. Yet education in Rumi's time was also intimate and personal, a matter of a student being taken in hand by a teacher, or a small circle of teachers, and imitating their adab or manners and style, as much as mastering a single field of apprenticeship. Dispatching his charge to Aleppo, Burhan was entrusting him with cosmopolitan choices, not only in interpreting religious law, but also in comportment, intellectual tastes, and moral conduct. With his disciple Salah, he accompanied Rumi as far as Kayseri, midway between Konya and Aleppo, where he stayed briefly with the governor who was building Burhan his own madrasa. Kayseri was the second most important city in Rome, as Sultan Alauddin Kaykubat I had built his ornate Qubatiye palace on its lakefront. As a married student, with an ascetic practice encouraged by Burhan, Rumi lived a circumscribed life in a traditional student cell in the most famous of the colleges of Aleppo, the Halaviye, which was converted into a mosque from a Byzantine cathedral a century earlier as revenge against the Franks for pillaging during the First Crusade. While Rumi was in Aleppo around 1223, the Halaviye was sliding into disrepair and barely used as a teaching facility. Such schools were as much dormitories with charitable endowments for supporting residential students as academics granting certificates. The situation was fluid as mosques evolved into schools, then changed back again, and Rumi was free to follow lectures at the Shadbacht Madrasa or reading circles at the Great Mosque. Much like Konya, Aleppo was flourishing in a rare phase of peace and prosperity. The previous Ayyubid Sultan al-Zahir, a son of the famed commander Salatin, who had founded an Ayyubid dynasty in both Egypt and Syria, had reinforced the oval citadel in the center of town, added a grand entranceway, repaired the canal system, and built a palace, upgrading Aleppo into one of the most beautiful cities in the Middle East. His son Al-Aziz, who ruled during Rumi's school years, capitalized on the advantages of the city's trading location on caravan routes linking China with Europe, bringing in revenues second only to Egypt. The wood-roofed bazaar with its trading floor, offering local specialties such as pistachios and the glassware that glimmered in Rumi's later poems. I am the slave of hopeless time until that time. The wine of unity shines in a chalice of Aleppo glass. Like the interlocking patterns displayed on its stone and marble walls and portals, Aleppo was a complex mesh of East and West, Christian and Muslim. Much of its prosperity came from shrewd trading agreements with Venus, and allowed Phoenician merchants to establish a colony in Aleppo, with their own trading post, baths, and church. In 1219, Francis of Assisi met in Egypt with the Ayyubid Sultan and won an agreement for his monks of the rope to wander the Holy Land. During the time of Rumi's stay, the first Franciscan friars began arriving in Aleppo to minister to Crusader princes and soldiers held prisoner in the citadel. They swept through the streets in their rough woolen robes, much like the robes worn by Sufis, with similar vows of poverty, and may have imprinted on Rumi the affinities between these two expressions of spirituality. Rumi's main teacher in Aleppo was Ibn al-Latim, a quick-witted and urbane scholar, historian, legal expert, diplomat, and calligrapher in his mid-40s, with a post at Shadbakht Madrasa. 5 members of his eminent Hanfi old family, including his father, had served in the powerful post of Chief Justice, or Qazi, in Aleppo since the 10th century. Ibn al-Latim was best known as a historian of Aleppo and as a biographer of its leading citizens in his biographical dictionary, a massive 40-volume who's who of short vignettes, written by him in penmanship so fine that the Sultan once summoned him to the palace to praise its beauty. He also wrote treatises on preparing perfumes and on handwriting, practices, pens, and papers, as Arab intellectuals of his time were given to such encyclopedic boundless compilation. He did most of his writing on diplomatic missions for the Sultan, when he travelled on a palanquin rigged between 2 mules. Ibn al-Latim was a master of the basic sciences, explaining his quick ascent in the academic ranks, and was equipped to instruct Rumi in most areas of knowledge required for an advanced religious scholar: Arabic linguistics and grammar, dialectic reason and legal conflict, and the Quranic sciences. He gave indications of being a fellow traveller of Sufism, though he was too shrewdly political to proclaim such sympathies openly. In the early years of his reign, Al-Aziz had executed the Sufi leader Sohrawardi for heresy, yet his father had called on his deathbed for the prayer beads of a Sufi saint, and Ibn al-Latim reserved a room in his own tomb for a Sufi, perhaps as a hedge against divine judgment. He espoused, if not always fully practiced, the virtues of poverty, solitude, and self-reliance. While Rumi never absorbed his teacher's passion for history, he was delighted by his exposure in Aleppo to the intricate joys of Arabic poetry. Ibn al-Latim was a minor poet. He wrote clever lines on slight topics, such as citing the first white hairs in his beard. Yet he idolized those with innate poetic ability and championed the poetry of the premier Arabic poet al-Mutanabbi, whose verses remained a lifelong treasure for Rumi. During the 11th century, al-Mutanabbi had lived in the quarter of Aleppo where Ibn al-Latim's family's marble compound is located. Rumi's favorites were al-Mutanabbi's qasidas, often odes of praise for a patron, known for their technical virtuosity, though a surprising choice perhaps, given their standard use of the tradition of braggadocio and praise of wine, power, and battlefield glory. Al-Mutanabbi wrote zestfully of the play of swords and lances and the clash of armies at my command. Rumi later scattered lines of al-Mutanabbi in his talks, and one of the Arab poets' more famous openings, a heart that wine cannot console, entwined for Rumi with memories of school years in Syria, he transposed as a closing for a poem in spiritual wine. We can look for the answer in Mutanabbi, a heart that wine cannot console. In Aleppo, Rumi was also introduced to an active Shia community, especially visible during the festivals of the family of Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, whose heirs are believed by Shia to be the rightful holders of the leadership of all Muslims. The Sunni rulers observed these festivals verily, while Rumi's teacher, Ibn al-Adim, a member of the establishment, was described by his biographer as a sentinel of the Sunni state. On the day of Ashura, mourning the death of Ali's son Hussein at the Battle of Karbala in 680, Rumi witnessed pious Shia weeping and beating themselves at Antioch Gate, the main fortress gate at the entrance of Aleppo. Thinly disguising himself as a poet, Rumi recorded this memory in Masnavi. On the day of Ashura, all the people of Aleppo gather from day until night at the Antioch Gate. One day a stranger who was a poet came along on this day of Ashura and heard their lamentations. He went along, asking questions gently on his way. What is this sorrow? Whose death are they mourning? Though Rumi may not have been previously aware of this ritual, as Persians were mostly Sunni during his lifetime, his naivete in rendering the experience was exaggerated, as he feigned discovering that the martyrdom being mourned had taken place centuries earlier. Have you been asleep all this time? You are only now tearing your garments in sorrow? Rumi may have felt some shock as a young man, but revisiting the event in his maturity, he was more intent on questioning sorrow as a response to death rather than joy. Mourn for your own broken faith in religion, if your faith doesn't see beyond this old earth. The second phase of Rumi's advanced education took place in Damascus, where he likely traveled about a year later and had previously visited with his family during their original journey from Central Asia. While Aleppo was known as a trading and mercantile city, Damascus in southern Syria, in the midst of a desert oasis, was both a commercial center and a holy city. The capital of the former Umayyad Caliphate and one of the important departure points for Hajj, especially for pilgrims traveling from points west. Because of the city's religious history and geography, students of the Quran were welcomed and treated respectfully. The magnificent Umayyad Mosque, still enshrining the reputed head of John Baptist from its previous days as a Christian basilica, hummed all day with groups of students listening to their sheikhs read aloud. As Damascenes were not encouraged to read books silently or alone, the murmur of these many study circles was a kind of spoken music, filling the courtyards daily from dawn until dusk. Over about 4 years, in his mid-20s, Rumi studied in Damascus in one of the Hanfi seminaries, probably the Muqaddamiya Madrasa, near the Bab al-Firdaus or Gate of Paradise, where he could stay in an outer building, free of the nighttime regulations overseeing entrances and exits that were enforced on younger students in the inner buildings. Of his studies of one important Hanfi text, he later recalled, "In my youth I had a friend in Damascus who was a companion with me in studying the Hidayah." He also seems to have attended sessions of a famed Hanfi scholar from Bukhara who was teaching at Nouriya Madrasa. All public classes were highly formal, modeled on behavior in a mosque, with a nearly sacred space cleared about the lecturer, so his rug and cushion were left untouched. As one manual prescribed proper student etiquette, do not look at anything but the teacher, and do not turn around to investigate any sound, especially during discussion. Do not shake your sleeve. The student should not uncover his arm, nor should he fiddle with his hands or feet or any part of his body parts, nor should he place his hand on his beard, nor should he try to say anything funny or offensive, and he should not laugh, except out of surprise. If something overcomes him, he should smile without giving voice. Though student life is rigorous, Rumi loved his time in Damascus. He often called Damascus the city of love, punning on the word for love, ishq, tucked into its Arabic name, Damashq. He even wrote a single example of an ode to a city for Damascus, not only as homage to the capital, but also to Arabic poetry, where such love poems to cities abound, especially to Baghdad. Only Samarkand comes across in his writings with such verve and close observation. He exuberantly opens his city poem, "I'm madly in love and crazy for Damascus, Damascus where I left my heart and soul." Rumi catalogues the most prominent of the 13 gates to the medieval city. Separated from friends, I stand alone at the Barit gate, beyond the lover's mosque in the green fields of Damascus. Far from the gate of joy and the gate of paradise, you'll never know what visions I'm seeking in Damascus. His references are often built on inside jokes that only other visitors to Damascus at the time would fully understand. The Ayyubid Sultan, during his stays in town, liked to play polo in the verdant field hippodrome, where Rumi imagined his own head as a swerving ball. I want to roll through our verdant field like a polo ball, struck by polo sticks, towards the main square of Damascus. A large Quran commissioned by Caliph Osman was kept veiled as a relic in the mosque. Let me swear an oath on Osman's holy book, the pearl of that beloved, shining in Damascus. The soft border between Muslims and Christians was nowhere more evident than in Damascus, even in these waning days of the Crusades. Many Christians and Jews lived in the capital, though neighborhoods were segregated by religion, with gates clanged shut at the dusk curfew, and beliefs worn in the sleeve under a legal dress code. Christians wore crosses, and Jews a yellow or red shoulder robe. Syria was the historical center of monasticism, and Rumi was said to have come across a group of 40 desert fathers, or hermit monks, on his way from Aleppo. The Quran was understood to say that Jesus stayed on the hill of nearby Ribwa, and Damascenes hoped to witness his resurrection at their eastern gate. Let's climb Ribwa as if we're in the time of Christ, like monks drunk on the dark red wines of Damascus. The Bab al-Faraj, or Gate of Joy, evoked by Rumi, stood just east of the Saleh, or the righteous district, outside the walls of the old city, at the foot of prominent Mount Qasiyun. This neighborhood had grown in the past few decades and was crowded with mostly Sufi hostels and learning centers, explaining Rumi's exclamation, "On the Mount of Righteousness is a mine of pearls." The most illustrious of those pearls, of course, was Ibn Arabi, who Rumi may or may not have met in Malatya a decade earlier. Ibn Arabi lived the final phase of his life in Damascus and was buried in a tomb in Saleh. Whether Rumi was included in his reading circles? He was certainly aware of the famous mystic, definitely in attendance at readings of his voluminous texts. As Ibn Arabi was still producing them, though, was his godson Konavi, with whom Rumi had a gradually evolving friendship later in Konya. Some of Ibn Arabi's readings aloud were meant for Konavi's ears alone. Rumi saw venerated in the person of Ibn Arabi a sublime and knowledgeable approach to spirituality as an elite science available only to initiates with verified experience. Though tempted by Ibn Arabi's approach, he was never entirely committed. Along with dazzling verbal performances and abstruse examinations of religious thought, Rumi was surrounded in Damascus by a scholarly culture that valued rank and fame. Books were stacked according to importance, with the Quran on top of any pile. Seating at lectures radiated out from the sheikh in decreasing order of status, as he was faced with his most eminent guest, judged by knowledge, age, piety, or fame. Of these qualities, fame weighed most strongly, the making of a name, especially a name beyond Damascus, or even better, Syria. Sources of the time noted that one young scholar flashed his merit like a bright star rising on the horizon, and of another, his name flew to fill the regions, values far from Rumi's later yearning for a nameless sort of oblivion. Following nearly 5 years of study in Aleppo and Damascus, having saturated himself in steep and difficult texts, and having been exposed to some of the most renowned religious scholars of the day, Rumi, about 30 years old, returned to his teacher of teachers, Borhan. Rumi sought to integrate the last and most important missing piece in his education, held out by Borhan as the ultimate achievement: advanced lessons in spiritual practice designed to unlock interior practices even more demanding and essential for his future responsibilities than the academic exercises mastered in Syria. The meeting likely took place in Kayseri. The Sultan's governor had constructed by then the madrasa where Borhan was based, though he still made the trip of about 200 miles to Konya regularly. When Rumi arrived, the governor invited him to stay in his palace, but Borhan, channeling the words of Baha'u'llah, warned Rumi that schools were the proper place for scholars to reside. The name of the town reflected its grand past history as a Roman capital, and Rumi punned on the naming of Kayseri, or Kaysara, after the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, when alluding to Borhan, "When our Caesar is in Caesarea, don't keep us waiting in Elbistan." The brunt of Rumi's joke, Elbistan, was a smaller Anatolian city on the road to Syria. But their reunion might have taken place anywhere, as Borhan was now stressing the inner world with his pupil. In the tradition of the historical Sufi movement, Borhan trained Rumi in exercises of asceticism, especially fasting. Borhan had been dedicated to fasting all his life. During this period, he wrote in his notes of the exemplary effects of fasting on the soul. The thinner the shell of the walnut, the fuller is its nut, and the same for the almond and pistachio. He had advised his disciple Salah that even if he found himself unable to perform other devotions, he should never neglect fasting. Such self-denial was meant to instill martial discipline, as well as to wean the practitioner off the ordinary values of the world. The ultimate fasting of the elite meant the desire for God alone. From this intensive season in Kayseri, Rumi never relaxed his stance on fasting, a habit he pursued with passion, almost thrilled, becoming as identified as Borhan with the practice. In Book 5 of the Masnavi, he would lift off in an inspired hymn to fasting. "Don't eat straw and barley like donkeys. Graze on flowers of the Judas tree, like musk deer in Khotan. Only graze on clove, jasmine, or roses. In Khotan with your beloved companion. The stomach of the body pulls towards the straw barn. The spiritual stomach pulls towards the fields of sweet basil." If spring is the favorite season in Rumi's poems, Ramazan, the month of fasting from dawn to sunset, obligatory for able Muslims, became his cherished religious observance. "Congratulations, the month of fasting is here. Have a good journey, my companion in fasting. I climbed to the roof to see the moon. With my heart and soul, I longed for fasting. When I looked up, my hat fell off. My head was set spinning by the king of fasting." Fasting became a reminder for Rumi of memories of Borhan, as few anecdotes about the displaced mystic of Khorasan failed to link him with his habitual practice. Fasting was also Rumi's introduction to the consolations of tightening the belt. He was learning that things were not what they seemed and that empty stomachs held hidden sweetness. Like the scholars of Damascus, the mystics and Sufis had their own ranks and an organized ladder of mystical practices that indicated status in the spiritual world. More extreme than regular fasting, but essential, was the completion of a 40-day trial in sealed isolation from the world, known as Chil, from Chehel, Persian for 40. This period of solitude and subsisting on bread and water was a sort of vision quest, conceived as an inward Hajj or desert experience, owing its origins perhaps to the Syrian hermit monks, such as those Rumi met on his way to Damascus. Borhan arranged Rumi's retreat, sealing him into total seclusion and then helping him with interpreting his insights afterward. A chip of remembrance, likely from this retreat, appears in Book 5 of the Masnavi. This time, rather than a poet, Rumi casts his younger self as a certain man, but his exact recording of one disorienting nightmare was quite personal, nearly surreal. During the chill, a certain man dreamed he saw a pregnant dog on a road. Suddenly he heard the cries of her puppies, though they were in the womb invisible. Puppies howling in a womb, he thought. Has anyone ever heard of such a thing? Interpreting dreams was a problematic challenge, for medieval Muslims especially, a religious problem. Isolation only exacerbated Rumi's confusion, blurring his waking. When he woke from his dream and came to himself, his astonishment grew greater at every moment. During the chill, there is no other solution to problems except for being present to God the Almighty. So he began to pray and heard a wise voice interpreting his bizarre dream imagery. At that moment, he heard a mysterious voice saying, "That is a symbol of the yelping of the ignorant. Those who have not pierced the veil and curtain, but with blind eyes are speaking aimlessly." Rumi emerged from his chill with the personal experience of having heard a voice that he felt was available to him for guidance. He could hear wisdom not just in reading circles or from lecturers, but also in meditation, and he could copy down the words as in dictation. In trying to measure the gap between human and divine, such an encounter was revelatory. After instructing Rumi in the wisdom tradition shared with him by Baha'u'llah and encouraging him even more insistently to study his father's notebooks, Borhan began to decline. During his last few years, Borhan was sometimes in Konya, but he kept returning to Kayseri, possibly wishing to withdraw so that his charge could take on a leadership position alone. In Kayseri, Borhan showed poignant signs of loss of the strength, mental focus, and near-athletic prowess and self-discipline that marked his prime years, though his behavior was also taken as evidence of saintliness, of having moved beyond the ordinary restraints of religion. When he led prayers in the mosque, he spent long stretches of time rather than minutes in bowing or standing poses. When some members of the congregation complained, he apologized. "Some madness continually overwhelms me. I am not fit to be your prayer leader." The plea only made him more revered and followed, as he was now understood to be as humble as he was wise. More striking was the transformation of the rigid ascetic into a corpulent gentleman. As he relaxed his tight regimen, Borhan once heard a voice commanding, "Undergo no further hardship." He now obeyed this voice. A grand lady who had become his disciple teasingly asked why he had given up fasting and was not practicing his 5 daily prayers. "Oh, child, I am like a load-bearing camel," he replied, comparing himself to an emaciated camel at journey's end, being fed a few grains of barley. When his patron, the governor, grew concerned about his unkempt appearance, he snapped, "So I came into the world for the sake of doing my laundry? Leave me alone." Rather than feats of fasting, Borhan focused on his love of pickled turnips for indigestion. In old age, he began behaving with some of the carefree joy of the holy fools for God of Nishapur. Borhan died in Kayseri in 1240 or 1241 in his mid-70s. Following a conventional mourning period of 40 days, a letter was sent notifying Rumi in Konya. A decade after the death of his father, this news had a similar impact. Rumi collapsed into the knowledge that he was again without fatherly support. He set out quickly with a band of disciples on a road he traveled regularly enough during those years to recall later all the stops on the way, while illustrating the difference between ritual and true spiritual progress. The stages on the road from Konya to Kayseri are fixed and defined. They are Kemas, Upruch, Sultan, and so forth. But the stages on the sea between Antalya and Alexandria are not fixed and defined. A ship's captain may know them, but he won't tell them to land dwellers, because they would not understand. Rumi visited the grave of his mentor and held a funeral banquet in his honor. Borhan's books and notes were spread out for him to choose whatever he wished. He cherished these words and found, in rereading them, the connection so important in his growth over the past decade. As with his father's writings, Borhan left Rumi not only hard ascetic rules, but also messages of love that were the soft core of his discipline of curbing impulses. If you prick your foot on a thorn, you would leave all the important things aside and wholly attend to it. You ought then to do the same for your brother. In his mid-30s, Rumi finally, if inevitably, ascended to the leadership of his community. At the Madrasa Khudavandgar, he was looked upon as the living embodiment of Baha'u'llah and Borhan. He walked the streets of Konya in the official garb of a religious scholar, wearing a cumbersome white-sleeved cloak and a large turban, wound with one band unravelled and hanging down his back. Although he never served in Konya as Chief Justice or Qazi, he held academic appointments at 4 separate colleges, all respected, including the Cotton Sellers Madrasa, endowed by the Guild of Cotton Merchants and located on their street in the Market District. His name appeared on lists of the most prominent doctors of the law belonging to the Hanfi school. At about the same time as the death of Borhan, Rumi's wife Gohar also mysteriously died, with no record of the cause. Again, Rumi experienced the loss of an intimate link to his childhood in Central Asia, as well as, most crucially, the mother of his 2 sons. Yet Gohar's mother continued to live in the harem and take special interest in her grandsons. Rumi soon afterward married a widow, Kera, from a Roman Turkish family in Konya, whose deceased husband Muhammad Shah had been an aristocratic Persian speaker from Iran. Like Rumi, Kera brought 2 children to their marriage, a boy, Shamsuddin Yahya, and a girl, Kimia. Over the next few years, Rumi and Kera had their own sons, Muzaffaruddin Amir Alam Chalebi, Rumi's third, and a daughter, Maleke. With these 4 young children, the harem grew even more crowded and busier. Unlike his father, Rumi never kept multiple wives, and the widower and his widowed bride remained together for the rest of his life. Kara was more vividly remembered than Gohar, as theirs was not an arranged marriage, and she lived with Rumi during the period of his growing fame. Though he never wrote about Kara directly, she was remembered by those in his inner circle, and was later the source of some of the more magical and fantastical ideas about her husband. Her choice to leave the aristocratic household of her deceased husband to marry a cleric pointed to spiritual leanings, underlined in Aflaki's description of her as a second Virgin Mary. She was certainly superstitious and was forever seeing jinn, or invisible mischievous spirits. Early in their marriage, Rumi used to stand by a tall lampstand at night, reading his father's pages. She told him that the jinn complained to her of the bright light. Rumi smiled and 3 days later tried to mollify her. After today, do not worry. The jinn are my disciples and they are devoted to me. They will not cause any harm to come to our children or friends. Rumi's bemused smile to Kara on news of the jinn, either patronizing, loving, or both, expressed some of the enigma of his attitude towards women in marriage, as well as the general ambivalence towards women in medieval society. Rumi often fell into a traditional classifying of men as strong and rational, and women as mercurial and emotional. He once even painted wives as purifying tests for their coarse husbands. God showed the Prophet a narrow and hidden way to refine himself, and that was the path of marrying women and enduring their tyranny and listening to their complaints and letting them order him around. Character would only become purer through such patient forbearance. In other moods he could be more sympathetic, as in his ode in the Masnavi to women. A woman is a ray of God, heavenly and beloved. She is a creator, uncreated from above. Rumi later argued against imposing veils on women, and had many female disciples whose Friday evening gatherings in one lady's garden he was criticized for attending. When his 2 older sons reached adolescence, Rumi sent them both to study in Damascus, a decision that distressed their maternal grandmother, the great Kara, as she would miss them greatly. He evidently thought highly enough of Damascus as the standard for religious education. Overseeing them on this trip was their tutor and guardian, Sharafuddin. Yet as both boys were now in their mid-teens, the combativeness of their childhood conflicts was only magnified. When they were younger, Rumi himself had mostly been away in Syria, leaving his first wife, Gohar, with the problem of their bad behavior. Now the target of their rebelliousness in Damascus quickly became their tutor, and Rumi was upset at needing to write them a pointed letter, advising them to be more respectful to their elders. Dear son Bahauddin, and my dear son Alauddin, don't forget to be polite to this father, the father of your education and training, Sharafuddin. Don't be rude or judgmental or abusive, and treat him as a father. I am indebted to this dear father, Sharafuddin. I am hoping that my dear children will be patient and kind and generous with him, and talk to him in a very kind way. And when this father is angry, I want my children to make themselves busy with other matters or go to sleep. I am waiting to receive some news, and I pray for my children to become more kind, and hopefully very soon you will return home and make us happy. Rumi was now flourishing in Konya, where he had become known for the power and popularity of his eloquent preaching. By the time he was 17 and had returned from Syria, his son Bahauddin, later known as Sultan Balad, would sit next to his father during these sermons, just as Rumi sat next to his father Baha'u'llah. However, Rumi had such a youthful appearance that when the 2 appeared together in public, they were often mistaken for brothers. Rumi was satisfying his patrons, the Sunni Seljuk rulers, as his public speeches displayed enough emotion and beauty to convert Greeks and Armenians, a desired outcome for the regime. He could later still summon the fervent emotion that his sermons had stirred among local Greek speakers who did not understand much of their content. I was speaking one day to a crowd that included non-Muslims, and during my talk they were weeping and going into ecstatic states. What do they understand? What do they know? Someone asked. Not 1 out of 1,000 Muslims can understand this sort of talk. What if they comprehended that they can weep so? It was not necessary for them to understand the words. What they understood was the essence of the speech, the oneness of God. Seeing the response of audiences from the viewpoint of his father as he sat beside him, Sultan Walid, too, recalled the excitement stirred by his gifted and warm-hearted oratory. Now that he stood alone, his greatness became more visible in the eyes of the old and the eyes of the young, even among those who had kept their distance from him before. Yet Rumi was not wholly satisfied by this early success. Ironically, he had achieved everything his father and tutor desired for him, and attained the goals and station considered most lofty by his society at a relatively young age. Ever since childhood, he had been a bit of a prodigy, and always had a graceful power over those around him. These indicators of success were borne out by his talents as a teacher, preacher, jurist, and spiritual counselor. He travelled both outward and inward paths of education, yet he was feeling incomplete, inauthentic, not yet arrived at his destination. Now in his late 30s, Rumi particularly puzzled over the limits of the learning he had accumulated with such exertion in Aleppo and Damascus. Expending great effort was another virtue of the scholarly culture. He struggled as well with fame, the sort of important status recognized by the scholars. By his combination of the authority of learning with youthful charm and charisma, he attracted an eager retinue, if not quite the 10,000 more newly minted followers counted by Sultan Walid.